He built a cattle empire on fear. Now the frontier is ready to burn it down. Cattle King, a wild western thriller. Chapter 1. The horse smelled the water before Rip Campbell saw the town. 3 hours of hard riding through red rock country, and the roan's ears came up sharp, nostrils pulling at the desert air. Campbell let him have his head, shifting in the saddle to ease the burn across his lower back. The sun had dropped behind the western ridgeline, but the heat still pressed down like a flat iron, and the alkali dust that had coated him since the Texas border sat in the creases of his neck and tasted like old copper on his lips. Palos Duros appeared out of the scrub, and the heat shimmered as a smear of brown buildings against a caliche flat, one main street running north to south, a water tower at the far end that somebody had painted red once upon a time. Campbell read the town the way he read all towns, slow from the outside in. He counted the horses at the hitch rails. He noted the 2 men standing in front of the feed store, who stopped talking when they saw him. He saw the sign above the wide plank saloon 2 spot, painted in crooked letters, and beneath it a second-floor gallery where a woman in a yellow dress leaned on the railing, watching the street with the professional patience of a woman who watched streets for a living. He rode in at a walk. The roan went to the trough in front of the saloon and drank. Campbell swung down, his boots raising a small cloud when they hit the hardpan. He looped the reins around the rail and stood still a moment, working the cramp out of his left thigh. A boy of maybe 12 sat on the saloon steps, whittling a stick into nothing in particular, and watching Campbell with large, serious eyes. "That your horse?" the boy said. "What's left of him?" Campbell pulled his hat off and beat it against his leg, knocking loose a season's worth of Texas. "Where's the livery?" The boy pointed with his whittling knife. "End of Calhoun Street. Mr. Pruitt runs it. He charges 4 bits for the night, grain extra." "Much obliged." "You staying?" Campbell looked at the boy. Looked at the street. A wagon creaked past, driven by a Mexican woman with a sack of flour in the bed, and she kept her eyes straight ahead the way people do when keeping their eyes straight ahead has become a habit of survival. "Haven't decided," he said. He tied the roan at the rail and went into the 2 spot. The saloon was long and narrow, smelling of sawdust and sour mash, and the particular sourness of men who work outdoors in the heat. A piano sat against the back wall, with its lid closed and a fern dying on top of it. The bar ran the length of the left wall, and behind it a big man with forearms like stovewood stood polishing a glass that was never going to get any cleaner. 3 cowboys occupied one table near the window, and a man in a clerk's suit sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a beer and reading a newspaper folded to a small rectangle. Campbell took the stool at the near end of the bar, his back to the wall at a slight angle, and put his hat on the wood. "Whiskey," he said. "Whatever you're not ashamed of." The barman set a glass in front of him and poured from a bottle without a label. Campbell drank it. It burned clean. "Rip Campbell," said a voice from his right. He turned. The man in the clerk's suit had folded his newspaper and was looking at him over the top of his beer glass. He was somewhere between 40 and 50, smooth-faced, with dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of eyes that stayed pleasant no matter what the rest of his face was doing. Well dressed for a cow town. The suit fit him, which meant he'd had it made. "You've got the advantage of me," Campbell said. "Tom Linton." The man stood and moved 2 stools down, carrying his glass. He moved like a man who'd never been told no. "I'm an attorney. I handle quite a few interests in Shotgun Valley." He settled onto the stool and set down his glass and extended his hand. Campbell looked at it and shook it. The grip was dry and measured. "Heard of you," Linton said, settling back. "You come up from Texas." "A lot of men come up from Texas." "Not many with your particular history." Campbell turned the whiskey glass slowly on the bar. "What is it you want, Mr. Linton?" "I want to buy you a drink and have a conversation." Linton nodded at the barman. "Frank, pour Mr. Campbell another." Frank poured it. "Word travels," Linton said. "Even out here. A man with your abilities and your, let's call it a complicated record, looking for a fresh situation. I may have something that fits." "I'm not looking for employment." Campbell picked up the glass. "I'm looking for a meal and a bed and maybe a week of quiet." "Of course." Linton smiled, and the smile reached his eyes the exact right amount. "There's a rooming house at the end of this block. Mrs. Teller runs it, clean and reasonable. And the cafe across the street does a decent steak." He stood and buttoned his coat. "We can talk another time. I just wanted to introduce myself." He left a coin on the bar and walked out, and the door swung shut behind him without a sound. Campbell sat with his drink. The three cowboys at the table near the window had lost interest in him, or made a good show of it. Frank the barman went back to polishing his glass. "Who does he work for?" Campbell said. Frank looked at him. "The lawyer," Campbell said. "Linton. Who does he work for?" Frank set the glass down and picked up another. "Most folks in the valley, at one time or another. He handles property, contracts, estate matters." He paused. "Main one is Gene Eastston. You'll hear the name. Everybody does." "What's Eastston's business?" "Cattle. Three Deuces Ranch. He runs maybe 3,000 head on range that reaches from the north end of the valley, clean down to Hog Hollow. Bought out 6 smaller spreads in the last 4 years." Frank said it the way a man states a fact, without color to it, which told Campbell everything about the color it contained. He finished the whiskey and left money on the bar. Outside, the light had gone purple, and the first stars were coming out above the eastern ridgeline. A lamp burned in the window of the cafe across the street. A man in range clothes came out of the hardware store 2 doors down and walked past Campbell without looking at him, and Campbell saw the 3 Deuces brand on his vest before he turned the corner. The woman in the yellow dress was still on the gallery above him. He looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and neither of them spoke, and then Campbell put his hat on and went to find the livery. He took the roan down Calhoun Street in the near dark, the horse's hooves sounding hollow on the dry ground. The livery sat back from the street behind a set of double doors, wide enough to drive a freight wagon through, and from inside came the smell of hay and horse dung, and the lantern-lit sound of someone moving in the stalls. "Hello, the barn," Campbell called. A man appeared in the doorway, old enough that his hair had gone white, wearing a canvas apron dark with years of use. He looked at the roan the way a man looks at a horse before he looks at the rider. "Nice animal," he said. "He needs water, grain, and rest in that order." "Pruitt." The old man took the reins when Campbell handed them over. "4 bits the night, 2 bits more for grain. I may need him on short notice." Pruitt looked at him. "Most men say that." "Most men don't need him on short notice when they say it." The old man studied him a moment. "Your gear'll be safe here. Nobody bothers my barn." He said it as a statement of local law. Eastston's men use the other end of the street. Big remuda, change horses twice a day sometimes. He led the roan inside without looking back. "You want a recommendation for a room? Mrs. Teller takes in boarders." "Someone already told me." "Then someone's looking after you," Pruitt said from the dark of the barn. "In this town, that's worth noticing." Campbell stood outside the livery for a moment and looked back toward the main street. The two-spot threw a rectangle of yellow light across the hardpan. From somewhere north of town, a coyote made its sound against the night sky, and then another answered it from the direction of the river, and then they went quiet. He pulled his saddlebags off his shoulder and walked toward the rooming house, and the dark closed in behind him, And whatever was coming in Palos Duros, he would meet it rested, with a clean face and a loaded gun. The sign above Mrs. Teller's door said rooms, respectable only. Campbell knocked. Chapter 2. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her 60s, built square and solid in a house dress the color of old slate, with white hair pinned tight, and the kind of face that had made up its mind about most things and saw no reason to revisit them. She looked at Campbell the way she might look at weather moving in off the mountains, not afraid of it, just assessing it. "Mrs. Teller," he said. "That's right. I need a room. Was told you're the place." She looked at his saddlebags, then at his boots, then at his face. Her eyes paused at the gun on his hip, the way eyes do when they've been trained not to pause at guns. "How long?" she said. "Week to start. Maybe longer. I don't run a saloon or a gambling house. You want either of those? The two-spot is where you've come from. I don't allow women upstairs. I serve breakfast at 6 and supper at 7, and I don't hold either for late arrivals. The outhouse is in back, and I keep it clean. $1 a week, $2 includes meals." $2, he said. She stepped back from the door and let him in. The hallway smelled of pine oil and something baking, bread maybe or biscuits kept warm in the oven. She led him up a staircase that didn't creak, which told him something about the upkeep of the place, and showed him a room at the end of the hall. Narrow bed with a blue quilt, a washstand, a window that faced the back alley. A hook on the door for a coat. A braided rug on the plank floor. Water's in the pitcher. I'll have the girl bring more in the morning. There's a basin. She stood in the doorway. "I run a quiet house, Mr. Campbell." "Mr. Campbell? What brings you to Palos Duros?" It wasn't a question, so much as an inventory. He set his saddlebags on the floor and looked at her. "Rest," he said. "Oh, how?" She pulled the door to as she left, and her footsteps went back down the hall and descended the stairs without hurry. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots and set them side by side on the rug. He hung his gun belt on the bedpost. He stretched out on top of the quilt with his hands behind his head and looked at the ceiling in the dark and listened to Palos Duros settle around him, the distant piano starting up in the two-spot, a dog working itself into a complaint somewhere on a back street, the night wind off the desert finding the gap in the window frame and moving the curtain in a slow, irregular way. He didn't sleep for a while. He didn't try to. Breakfast was eggs, salt pork, biscuits with sorghum, and coffee black enough to stand a boot in. 2 other boarders occupied the table. A surveyor named Gaines, who talked about land elevations the way some men talk about women, and an older drummer in a wrinkled coat who sold harness fittings to ranches across the territory and had been selling them for 20 years without apparently having sold enough to retire. Neither man asked Campbell what he did or why he was in town, which either meant they had manners or they had sense. He ate and drank 2 cups of coffee and left a third of his biscuit on the plate because his stomach had shrunk on the trail. The sheriff's office sat on the east side of the main street, a low adobe building with a covered porch and a hitching rail out front that needed a new rail board on the left end. A hand-lettered sign beside the door said Dan Bailey, Sheriff, Shotgun Valley Territory. No decoration to it. Just the facts. Campbell went inside. The office held a desk, 2 chairs, a gun rack with a Winchester and a shotgun, and a pot-bellied stove that had a coffee pot on top of it. The man behind the desk was reading a folded document through a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles and didn't look up. "Sit down," Bailey said. Campbell sat. He studied the sheriff the way he'd studied the town, from the outside in. Dan Bailey was maybe 60, lean as a fence rail but not frail, with a white mustache and hands that had worked hard for a long time. The badge on his chest was worn, the silver gone dull. His desk was orderly. The document he was reading, he turned face down, before he set it aside, and looked at Campbell over the tops of his spectacles. "Tom Linton came in this morning," Bailey said. "Before you did?" "I imagine he did. He says he ran into you at the 2 spot last evening, and you made a good impression." Bailey took off his spectacles and folded them. "Tom's impressed by things he's going to find useful. It's a quality he has." He mentioned deputy work. "He tells me things are his idea when sometimes they're mine." Bailey opened a desk drawer and pulled out a tobacco pouch and began filling a pipe, unhurried about it. "I've got 2 deputies. One of them is adequate. The other one, I'm less sure about." He tamped the tobacco with his thumb. "I know who you are, Mr. Campbell. I know where you've come from and why." Campbell watched him light the pipe with a match from a tin on the desk. "You going to tell me I'm not welcome?" Campbell said. "No." Bailey shook out the match and dropped it in an ash tin. "Men run from things they shouldn't have done, and sometimes they run from things they had no choice in. I've been wearing a badge since 1861, and I can generally tell the difference." He pulled on the pipe, and the smoke came out slow and blue. "You killed a man who reached for something that looked like a gun. He reached for his wallet. In poor light, at a range of 12 feet, after he'd threatened you twice in public, and you had reason to believe he was armed." Bailey looked at him steady. "The Texas Rangers didn't see it that way." "No. The ranger who drove you out was the dead man's cousin." "Yes." "So you left. Better than the alternative." Bailey nodded like that settled something. He set his pipe in the ash tin and put his hands flat on the desk. "What I need is a man who can handle himself and handle trouble without making more of it. Not a man looking for a fight, and not a man who'll walk around one when walking around it is the wrong thing to do." He paused. "Tom Linton thinks he's hiring you for one set of reasons. I'm hiring you for another." Campbell looked at him. "You want to explain that?" "Not yet." Bailey opened his desk drawer again and produced a deputy's badge, the tin kind with a stamped star, and set it on the desk between them. "There are things moving in this valley that I've been watching for 2 years. Things that need a man with fresh eyes, and no local loyalties, and no history here to cloud his judgment." "I've got plenty of history," Campbell said. "Just none of it local. That's what I need." Bailey pushed the badge across the desk. Campbell looked at it, sitting there on the worn wood. The star had a small dent in it, bottom left point, like it had been dropped on a stone floor once and nobody had bothered to fix it. He picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. "Pay," he said. "30 a month and found. Same as my other deputies." "What do you want me to do first?" "Learn the town," Bailey said. "Ride the valley. Find out who talks to you and who doesn't, and pay equal attention to both." He picked up his pipe again. "And stay clear of Gene Easton's outfit until I tell you different." "Why?" "Because Easton has money and lawyers and 3,000 head of cattle, and he's been buying up range in this valley for 4 years, and there are people trying to stop him and people trying to help him, and right now I can't tell which of those 2 groups is going to get somebody killed." He looked at Campbell through the pipe smoke. "Or which group already has." The room was quiet, except for the scratch of the pipe stem against Bailey's teeth. "You expecting trouble?" Campbell said. Bailey looked at him like the question had a funny edge to it. "Son," he said, "I've been expecting trouble in this valley for the better part of 2 years. What I'm expecting now is for it to stop being patient." Campbell turned the badge in his fingers once, then pinned it to his shirt. Bailey reached across the desk, and they shook hands, and Bailey's grip was like a man half his age, dry and sure, and he held it a beat past what was necessary, not in a measuring way, but the way you hold a handshake when you mean it. Go get yourself a meal, Bailey said. The cafe across the street does a decent steak. Woman who runs it is Irene Galloway. She'll give you the lay of the social landscape if you let her talk. He put his pipe back in the tin. Don't let her know you're interested. Campbell stood and settled his hat. Meaning she'll notice if I ask direct. Meaning most people in a town this size have decided what they think of a man before he opens his mouth. Let them think what they want. Bailey opened his document again and put his spectacles back on. That's when they tell you things. The door swung shut behind Campbell, and he stood on the porch a moment in the morning heat, the sun already white and hard above the eastern ridgeline, the main street of Palos, Duros, moving through its business around him. A freight wagon rolling south, two women with market baskets crossing from the dry goods store, a pair of Three Deuces cowboys coming out of the hardware with a coil of wire each. They glanced at the badge on Campbell's chest. One of them said something to the other, and they walked on without looking back. He stepped off the porch and crossed the street toward the cafe, and the smell of coffee and hot grease reached him before he got to the door. And above the door a small painted sign said simply, "Eats." He put his hand on the latch and went in. Chapter 3. You want eggs or you want to talk, Irene Galloway said. She stood at the end of the counter with a coffee pot in her hand, and the flat expression of a woman who'd heard every opening line a stranger ever invented. Both, Campbell said. Eggs first. She poured the coffee and left him to it. The cafe was 4 tables and a counter with 6 stools, the walls pine board painted once and not again. A calendar from a feed company showing a painted horse above the month of March. A card tacked beside the calendar said the special was beef stew, and that the price of pie had gone up a nickel. The smell was grease and coffee, and the faint sweetness of canned peaches. 2 men in work clothes shared the table nearest the window and ate without talking, the way men eat when they've got a long day in front of them. Irene brought his eggs, 2 of them, fried hard, with a side of potatoes that had been in the pan long enough to develop character. She set the plate down and refilled his coffee without being asked, which was either efficiency or a signal that she wanted him gone before the lunch crowd. He ate. She moved behind the counter, wiping things that were already clean. After a while he said, "Hog Hollow." "How far?" She set her cloth down. 7 miles south. You take the Mescal Road past the dry wash and bear left at the split cottonwood. Why? Bailey asked me to ride the valley. Bailey. She said the name the way you say the name of something you trust, but aren't sure you should. The Venttor's place is down there. Larry and Charlie. They run about 200 head on the South Range. She picked up her cloth again. Gene Eastston wants that range. I heard. Eastston wants most things in this valley. She said it without heat, as a statement of geography. The boys have been there 6 years. Built that place themselves post by post. They know trouble's coming? Larry knows. Charlie's the younger one. He knows too. He just thinks knowing it and doing something about it are the same thing. She looked at him directly for the first time. They don't need a deputy riding down there to tell them they're in a hard spot. They've got eyes. No, Campbell said. They don't? He left money on the counter and went to find his horse. The Mescal Road was 2 ruts pressed into caliche hardpan by years of wagon traffic, running south out of Palos, Duros, through a country of creosote and chala and gray limestone outcroppings that caught the morning light and threw it back without interest. The roan moved at an easy jog, his shadow pulling long to the west. A red-tailed hawk hung motionless over a draw to Campbell's right, riding a thermal he couldn't see, patient in a way only predators can afford to be. He found the split cottonwood at the fork, an old tree that lightning had split clean down the center, both halves still living, each growing away from the other like men who'd had a falling out and decided distance was the better answer. He bore left. Hog Hollow opened up a mile beyond the fork, the road dropping off the flats into a shallow basin rimmed by low ridges the color of dried blood. A creek ran through the bottom of it, mostly rock and sand this time of year, but with enough water in the bends to support a stand of cottonwood and willow that made a green stripe across the pale landscape. The Venttor's homestead sat on a bench above the creek, a main house of adobe and rough timber, a barn, a horse corral, a chicken run, and a kitchen garden behind a low brush fence that deer had been getting into. A man was splitting wood beside the barn. He was big, not tall but wide through the shoulders, with a chest like a barrel stave and forearms that swung the maul with a mechanical certainty. He wore a collarless shirt open at the throat, and canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He had dark hair and a jaw you could hang a lantern from, and he didn't stop swinging when Campbell rode into the yard, which either meant he'd heard him coming and wasn't worried, or he'd heard him coming and wanted to show he wasn't worried. In Campbell's experience, those were two different things. Campbell stopped the roan 20 feet out and waited. The man buried the maul in the splitting block and straightened up, breathing through his nose, his eyes on Campbell. Not on the badge. On Campbell. "Larry Venttor's?" Campbell said. "Who's asking?" "Rip Campbell. Deputy Sheriff. Bailey sent me out to learn the valley." Venttor's pulled a rag from his back pocket and dragged it across his face. He was younger than the build suggested, maybe 25, with eyes that were serious in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with a life that had made demands early. "Bailey send you out here particular," Venttor said, "or is this you riding around and seeing what's what?" "Both." Venttor's nodded like that was the right answer. "Get down then. Coffee's on." The inside of the house was spare but not poor. A plank table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with a cast iron pot hanging from the crane. A rifle stood in the corner nearest the door. A Winchester 73, worn but clean, the way a man keeps a tool he depends on. Shelves held canned goods in careful rows. A woman's quilt on the wall, faded but hung with care, the kind of thing you hang because somebody made it for you. Venttor's poured 2 cups from the pot on the stove and set them on the table and sat across from Campbell. "Charlie's out on the South Range," Venttor said. "Checking fence. Eastston's boys have been cutting it." "How long?" 3 weeks. First it was 1 strand, out where you'd figure a cow did it. Then it was 2 strands in the same place, a week later. Now it's whole sections pulled and laid flat." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Last week we found 2 of our steers on 3 Deuces Range. Jorgensen claimed they'd wandered. Said if we wanted them back, we'd have to pay his boys for the time it took to push them over." "Jorgensen. That's Easton's foreman. Nels Jorgensen. He's been in this valley 2 years, came up from Sonora with Easton." "Before that," Venttor stopped. "Go on." "Before that, people who know say he rode with a crew that worked the border. Not cattle. He drank his coffee. Nobody says it out loud. But nobody argues with him either." Campbell turned his cup on the table. Outside, a rooster made a complaint about something, and then gave it up. "Have you talked to Bailey?" "Bailey's a good man," Venttor said, with the particular courtesy men use when they mean something more complicated. "He's also 60 years old, and this valley's got 1,200 square miles in it, and Gene Easton's got 6 lawyers in Tucson." The sound of hoofbeats came across the yard, quick, uneven, the sound of a horse pushed harder than necessary. Both men heard it. Venttor's was on his feet before Campbell got his cup down. Through the open door, Campbell saw a rider come hard around the corner of the barn. A younger version of Larry Venttor's, but rangier, with a red bandana at his throat and his hat pushed back on his head. He pulled the horse up in the yard, and it skidded on the hardpan, throwing dust. "Jorgensen," the rider said. He was breathing hard. "He's at the south fence line. Him and 3 of his boys." They're not cutting it this time. Larry Venttor went to the corner of the room without a word and picked up the Winchester. Charlie. His voice had no rise in it. They're tearing out the posts, Larry. The whole corner section. Campbell stood and settled his hat. He looked at Larry Venttor with the rifle in his hands. Put it down, Campbell said. The silence in the room went taut. Your law, Larry said. Then go do what law does. I'll go. You'll stay here. Campbell moved toward the door. A man with a rifle riding into that situation gives Jorgensen exactly what he came here to get. Charlie looked at his brother. Larry's jaw worked once, and then he set the Winchester back in the corner, and the sound of it touching the wall was the quietest sound Campbell had heard all day. He went out into the yard and untied the roan and swung up, and he put the horse into a lope before he'd cleared the gate, riding south toward whatever Nels Jorgensen was building down at the fence line. Behind him, he heard Charlie Venttor say something in a low voice. He didn't turn around to hear it better. Chapter 4. Jorgensen had 4 men with him and a post puller on a mule, and he was not surprised to see a deputy ride up. He was the kind of man who was never surprised or worked at making sure it looked that way. He had pale eyes set close and a mouth that stayed flat no matter what he said, and he kept his hands visible and easy at his sides while Campbell told him the fence work was done for the day. This is 3 deuces range, Jorgensen said. Survey says different. Campbell held his reins in one hand and rested the other on his thigh 2 feet from his holster. Bailey'll pull the plat maps if you want to test it. Jorgensen chewed on that for a moment, not because he doubted it, Campbell figured, but because he was deciding what the move cost him. Then he said something in Spanish to one of his men, a short clipped word, and they loaded the post puller back on the mule and rode north without another sound. Jorgensen was last to turn his horse. He didn't look back. Campbell sat in the sun and watched them go until the dust they raised had settled back into the earth. That had been 6 weeks ago. The 4th of July came in on a Thursday with a sky the color of hammered copper, and a brass band from Tucson that arrived on the southbound stage 2 days early and immediately began arguing about money with the town council. By the time the disagreement was settled, the musicians had drunk up most of their advance, which meant they played the opening march slightly behind the beat and didn't seem to notice. Half of Shotgun Valley came to town for it. Wagons lined both sides of the main street from the feed store north to the church, teams unhitched and hobbled in the lot behind the livery, whole families spilling out of buckboards with basket lunches and clean clothes, and children who'd been scrubbed pink against their will. The dry goods store had bunting across the front. Somebody had strung paper lanterns between the 2 spot and the building across the street, and when the wind moved through them they swayed and threw colored light down onto the crowd below. Campbell stood on the boardwalk outside Bailey's office and watched it come together. Next to him, Bailey had his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and his hat squared on his head, and the expression of a man who is paid to enjoy nothing. "Eastston here yet?" Campbell said. "Came in this morning. He's at the hotel." Bailey's eyes moved through the crowd the way water finds its level, not searching, just reading the flow. "He'll make an appearance. Always does. Shakes hands, buys around at the 2 spot, makes sure everybody in the valley knows his face. Good politics. Good business," Bailey said. "There's a difference." Down the street, the band lurched into something intended to be a waltz. A cheer went up from the crowd near the dance platform, a flat square of planks laid over sawhorses in the wide lot behind the church, strung with lanterns on 4 poles. Couples were already taking position. Larry Venttor came out of the dry goods store with a paper parcel under his arm and stopped on the step, scanning the crowd with the focused attention of a man looking for one particular face among many. Campbell had seen that expression before. He'd worn it himself, a long time ago, in a different territory, with a different woman at the end of it, and it hadn't ended in a way he cared to remember. Venttor's found what he was looking for. Irene Galloway stood near the lemonade table with her hair down and her cafe apron exchanged for a blue dress that made the whole enterprise look like she'd been planning it. She was talking to another woman and not looking in Venttor's direction, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that said she knew exactly where he was. Larry went to her. The woman she'd been talking to found somewhere else to be. They spoke for a moment, too far away to hear, and then Larry held out his hand, and she took it, and they walked toward the dance platform. "How long has that been going?" Campbell said. "About as long as Easton's been noticing her," Bailey said. He produced his pipe but didn't light it, just held it. Which is a problem with several layers. Gene Easton materialized out of the crowd the way rich men do at public events, not walking so much as processing, with 2-3 deuces hands flanking him at a respectful distance and a smile on his face that had been engineered for exactly this kind of work. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair and a suit that cost more than most of the men in the crowd made in a month. He moved through handshakes and backslaps and nods, pausing at each one the exact right number of seconds, and the people he touched lit up a little, the way people do when wealth pays them attention. He saw Irene Galloway on the dance platform. Something shifted in the architecture of his face, brief enough that you'd miss it if you were watching his hands instead of his eyes. Then the smile came back, and he angled through the crowd toward the platform, and his 2 men adjusted their course to match without being told. "Who is she to him?" Campbell said. "He's been eating at her cafe 3 times a week for 4 months, Bailey said. Has her order a particular brand of coffee from Tucson. Sent her a crate of it last Christmas." He put the pipe stem in his mouth, unlit. "She hasn't discouraged it. She may not know how. A man like Easton, when he decides he wants something, he doesn't stop. He's never had to." The band swung into a reel, and the platform filled with dancers, Larry Venttor's among them, Irene's hand in his, both of them moving with the practiced ease of people who danced together before. Easton reached the edge of the platform and stood watching. His expression never changed. One of his men leaned in and said something, and Easton shook his head once, a small motion, and the man straightened up and went back to his position. Tom Linton appeared at Campbell's elbow. He'd come from nowhere, or from the kind of nowhere that politicians cultivate, the ability to arrive without being observed arriving. He had a glass of lemonade in his hand, and the easy carriage of a man who belonged everywhere he stood. "Quite a turnout," Linton said. "It is," Campbell said. "The valley's in good spirits." Linton sipped his lemonade and surveyed the crowd with a proprietary air, like a man assessing inventory. Independence Day does that. Reminds people what they're part of. Bailey said nothing. He was watching Easton at the edge of the dance platform, and Linton either didn't notice or pretended not to. "Mr. Campbell." Linton turned to him. "How are you finding things? The valley treating you well?" "Fine." "Good. Good." He paused, not a hesitation, a calculation. "I hope Bailey isn't running you too hard. A new man needs time to get his bearings." "I've got my bearings," Campbell said. Linton smiled and touched the brim of his hat, a small, elegant gesture, and moved back into the crowd. Campbell tracked him for 30 seconds. He stopped at 3 groups in quick succession, each one turning toward him with the attentiveness of people who expected something from the encounter. "He's counting votes," Bailey said. "For what office?" "Whatever office becomes available." Bailey bit down gently on his pipe stem. "Tom Linton is a man building a structure. He's been laying the foundation for 2 years, and most people in this valley don't know there's a construction project underway." On the dance platform the reel ended, and the band paused and the dancers broke apart. Eastston stepped up onto the boards and said something to Irene Galloway that made her smile tighten at the corners in a way that a smile wasn't meant to tighten. Larry Venttor stood 3 feet away with the paper parcel still under his arm, watching Eastston with the fixed patience of a man who is working very hard at being patient. Eastston put his hand on Irene's arm, a light touch at the elbow, proprietary in the way that wealthy men touch things they intend to own eventually. Larry Venttor's move. Campbell was off the boardwalk before he decided to move, crossing the lot at a diagonal, putting himself between Venttor's and the platform in the time it took the crowd to register that something was shifting in its current. "Larry." He said it low at close range. Venttor stopped. His face was a map of everything he was trying not to do. "Not here," Campbell said. "Not tonight." The music started again, something slow this time, a waltz with more ambition than the band could reliably execute. Eastston was already leading Irene onto the floor, one hand at her back, his head inclined toward her, in the attitude of a man sharing a confidence. Larry Venttor watched them for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the 2 spot without a backward look, his shoulders carrying everything he hadn't said. Campbell stayed where he was for a moment, in the middle of the crowd, the lantern light moving across the faces around him. Across the platform, through the shifting press of dancers and onlookers, he caught Bailey watching him from the boardwalk. The old sheriff gave one small nod, acknowledgement, nothing more, and went back to reading the crowd. Somewhere at the edge of the lot, half in shadow, Tom Linton stood with his empty lemonade glass and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing and gave nothing back. Chapter 5. 3 days after the 4th, the summer heat broke for an afternoon, and a dry wind came down off the Catalinas and pushed through Palos Duros like it had somewhere to be. By evening it had died, and the heat was back, and the air in the 2-spot saloon sat motionless, thick with tobacco smoke, and the sharp sweetness of spilled beer going sour on the floorboards. Campbell was at a back table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and a week's worth of county survey maps spread open on the wood. He'd been tracking the property line disputes in the South Range, 3 separate parcels where the boundary markers had been moved or pulled, all of them bordering 3 Deuces land. None of them reported to Bailey because the men who'd found them were afraid of what reporting meant. He was making notes in a small leather-bound book when the door opened and Charlie Venttor came in. He clocked the younger Venttor from the angle of his entry, quick, tight-shouldered, eyes pulling the room before his boots cleared the threshold. Not the loose entry of a man coming in for a drink. The entry of a man who'd been working up to something on the ride over and had arrived before he'd finished working up to it. Nels Jorgensen was at the bar. He stood with 2 3 Deuces hands, all 3 of them with their backs to the room in the deliberate way of men who don't need to watch a room because the room watches them. Jorgensen had a glass of rye in front of him, and his hat pushed back, and his pale eyes in the bar mirror fixed on Charlie Venttor the moment the door opened, which meant he'd been expecting this or something like it. Campbell folded his maps. Charlie crossed the room. The piano player, a thin man named Duckett who survived on tips and selective deafness, finished his measure and let his hands go still. The 2 cowboys at the table nearest the bar found reasons to push their chairs back from it. Jorgensen. The foreman turned from the bar with his glass in his hand, unhurried, the way a man turns when he holds all the cards and knows it. "Venttor's boy," he said. "Which one are you?" "You know which one." Charlie stopped 8 feet out. His hands were at his sides, fingers spread, the particular stillness of a man trying to keep them from doing something on their own. "You've been on our range again." "2 nights ago. I tracked the prints." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Our south water tank. Somebody pulled the drain plug and left it open. 3 days to fill that tank by hand." Jorgensen sipped his rye. "Cattle do strange things." "Cattle don't pull iron plugs." Maybe you ought to check your plugs, not just worn out. Old hardware on a played-out little spread. He set the glass on the bar behind him without breaking eye contact. Maybe everything on your place is just wearing out. The color came up in Charlie's neck. Campbell was on his feet, moving along the wall, keeping out of the sight lines. You tell Eastston, Charlie said, we're not selling. Not at his price, not at any price. That place is ours by deed, and by the 6 years we put into it, and there's no amount of cut fence and pulled plugs that changes that. That's a real pretty speech. Jorgensen's 2 men had separated along the bar, one drifting right, one left, a spread that happened without being told to happen, the automatic geometry of men who'd done this before. You've been practicing it, on the ride over. Call your men back, Campbell said. Every head in the room swung toward him. He'd come up along the wall, and stood now at Jorgensen's right, close enough to be inside any draw the foreman might attempt. Jorgensen's eyes moved to him with the slow deliberation of a man recalibrating. Deputy. A single word, neither hostile nor friendly. Call your men back to the bar. A beat of silence. Then Jorgensen lifted 2 fingers from his side, a small gesture, and his men drifted back. Campbell felt the room let out half a breath. You've got a complaint about the Venttor's property, Campbell said. You bring it to Bailey with documentation. You don't settle it in here. I haven't got a complaint, Jorgensen said. The boy has a complaint. I'm just having a drink. Then keep having it and let him leave. Jorgensen held his gaze for a long moment. Behind those pale eyes something moved and decided. He reached back for his glass and turned to the bar. It should have ended there. Murderer, Charlie Venttor said. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, and everything that followed came from it. Jorgensen set his glass down and turned back around, and his face had gone to something blank and without heat, which was worse than anger. Boy, he said, you need to walk out that door. You killed Pete Ardmore. Charlie's voice had gone flat and certain, the voice of someone who'd been carrying this for a long time and had just decided he was done carrying it. December. Out on the Mescal Road. They called it a robbery, but Pete didn't have $10 on him, and you were seen coming off that road that morning. Charlie. Campbell kept his voice level. This isn't the place. He needs to hear it out loud. Charlie's eyes hadn't left Jorgensen. Somebody needs to say it to his face. You're drunk, Jorgensen said. I've never been more sober. The foreman's right hand moved. Later, in the statements, in the inquest, in the weeks of argument that followed, people disagreed about what they'd seen. Frank the barman said Jorgensen went for his gun first, but he'd had his back to it. One of the 3 Deuces cowboys said Charlie reached first. The other said he couldn't say. Duckett, the piano player, who had the clearest angle in the room, said Jorgensen's hand was already coming up when Charlie drew. What was not disputed, Nels Jorgensen cleared leather. What was not disputed, he did not fire. Charlie Ventors put 1 round through the center of Jorgensen's chest from 8 feet, and the foreman went back against the bar, and slid down it, and the glass he'd been drinking from fell off the bar and broke on the floor beside him, and the sound of it breaking was the last sound in the room for a long moment after the gunshot stopped echoing. Campbell crossed to Jorgensen. He was dead before Campbell reached him, the slack-faced, absolute stillness that is not unconsciousness and cannot be mistaken for it. Campbell straightened up and turned. Charlie Venttor stood with the gun still in his hand, smoke threading up from the barrel, his face the face of a man who'd done the thing he set out to do and found that doing it felt nothing like he'd expected. Give me the gun, Campbell said. Charlie surrendered it without resistance. Gene Eastston arrived at the 2 spot 20 minutes later. He came in through the front with 2 of his men and his attorney, and he stood over Jorgensen's body for a long time without speaking, And when he finally raised his head, his face was composed in the way that grief composes itself when it has somewhere to go. "Murder," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. To the room." "Self-defense," Campbell said. Jorgensen drew first. "I was standing 6 feet away." Eastston looked at him with the measured attention of a man filing information. "You're new here, Deputy. You may not fully understand how things work in this valley." He turned to his attorney, a thin young man named Prudhomme who'd ridden up from Tucson 2 months ago and hadn't left. "Get the circuit judge. I want a proper inquest." "There'll be an inquest," Campbell said. "Bailey will see to it." "Bailey." Eastston said the name without inflection, which managed to say a great deal. He looked once more at Jorgensen on the floor, something passing across his face that Campbell couldn't read. Not grief exactly, more like a man reassessing the cost of something he'd already budgeted for. Then he walked out. Campbell stood in the two-spot with a dead man on the floor, and Charlie Venttor sitting in a chair, staring at his own hands, and the smell of burnt powder still hanging in the close air. Frank the barman set a fresh glass on the bar. "Whiskey," he said. "On the house." Campbell shook his head. He had to find Bailey, and after Bailey, he had to find Larry Ventors, and after that, he had the feeling things were going to move at a speed that wouldn't leave room for whiskey. He was out the door before the thought finished. Behind him, through the wall, he heard Charlie Ventors begin to cry, quiet, exhausted, the sound of a young man arriving somewhere he'd never meant to go. Chapter 6. The rider came in before sunrise, his horse lathered and blowing, and he beat on Bailey's door with the flat of his hand, until the old sheriff appeared in the frame with a lamp and a Winchester, and the expression of a man who has been pulled from sleep often enough that it no longer surprises him. "Eastston," the rider said. He was a Three Deuces hand named Corbett, young, his face white under the dust. "He's dead. In his buggy, up by the north gate. Bailey dressed in 3 minutes. He sent Corbett to Campbell's window with a rock." They rode out of Palos Duros in the gray pre-dawn light, the three of them, Bailey, Campbell, and a deputy named Oakes who handled the medical work when the circuit doctor was absent, which was most of the time. Corbett led them north on the main road, cutting east on a ranch track toward the Three Deuces gate, and nobody spoke. The desert came up around them in the early light, pale and enormous, the creosote throwing long shadows across the Caliche Flats. The buggy sat 30 yards inside the gate, off the track in the scrub, the horse still in harness and cropping what dry grass it could reach. The animal's traces had gone slack and tangled, which meant it had been standing there for some hours. A lantern hung from the buggy's side bracket, burned down to nothing. Eastston was in the seat. He sat with his head tipped back at an angle that had nothing natural in it, his hands in his lap, his eyes open to the sky that was going from black to purple above the eastern ridgeline. He wore his good suit, the one Campbell had seen him in at the dance, the dark wool that cost more than most men earned in a season. The entry wound was in his chest, left of center, the cloth around it stiff with dried blood. One shot. Close range, given the spread. Bailey climbed up to the seat with the care of a man whose knees have opinions about such things, and studied Eastston without touching him. Then he climbed down and moved around the buggy in a slow circuit, his eyes on the ground. "Oakes," he said. Oakes came forward and did what he needed to do, and when he finished he stood back and said, 8 hours. Maybe 10. Small caliber, 44 or 38. Whoever fired knew where to put it." "Meaning what?" Campbell said. "Meaning it wasn't a lucky shot from a nervous man. It was placed." Campbell moved out from the buggy in a widening circle, reading the ground. The desert floor held sign well in the early light, the shadows deep in every depression and hoofprint. He found what he was looking for 20 feet off the track, the pressed earth and scattered dung where a second horse had stood for a while, facing the buggy. The prints of that horse going in came off the track at a trot. Going out, they were at a dead run, headed southeast. Southeast was Hog Hollow. He came back to where Bailey stood by the buggy wheel. Horse stood over there, Campbell said. Long enough to ground tie and wait. Single rider. Leaving, he ran the horse hard toward the south range. Bailey produced his pipe and held it unlit. Anything else? Boot prints near the buggy step. One set, coming in close. They're on top of the buggy wheel tracks, so they came after the buggy stopped. He paused. And there's a second set. Smaller. Came in from the ranch road, stood near the front wheel, then went back the same way. 2 people at this buggy, after it stopped. At least. Bailey turned and studied the Three Deuces ranch house, visible a quarter-mile up the track, its windows going yellow as the hands inside lit their morning lamps. We'll need to talk to everyone on this property, he said. Starting with whoever opened that gate last night. The cook's name was Lee Bell. He was a small, precise man somewhere in his 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that moved with the economy of someone who'd spent 30 years working in confined spaces. He stood in the ranch kitchen with his arms at his sides and told his story to Bailey in a clear, measured voice while Campbell stood near the cold stove and said nothing. The story was this: he had been unable to sleep. At some time between 10 and 11, he had risen and gone to the kitchen for water. Through the kitchen window, he had seen a rider coming down the north track at speed, a man on a dark horse, no lantern. The moon had been up. He had recognized the rider as Larry Venttor's by his coat, a distinctive canvas duster with a torn left pocket that Venttor's wore when he worked his range. You've seen Venttor's wear that coat before, Bailey said. Yes. Several times when he came to the ranch to speak with Mr. Eastston about the property boundary. In the dark at distance, you recognized a coat. The moon was bright, Lee Bell said. And I know that coat. Campbell's eyes moved around the kitchen without appearing to. The window Lee Bell had described was above the dry sink, facing north. The north track was 100 yards from the house, at its nearest point. He filed the distance away. What time did Mr. Eastston leave the ranch yesterday evening? Bailey said. Around 7. He had his buggy brought around. Did he say where he was going? A fraction of a pause, brief enough that a man not specifically listening for it would have missed it entirely. No. Was he alone when he left? Yes. Bailey asked 3 more questions, and Lee Bell answered them all in the same clear, unhurried voice, and then Bailey thanked him and they went outside. Campbell walked to the kitchen window and stood where Lee Bell would have stood, and studied the north track across 100 yards of dark ranch yard. Well, Bailey said from behind him. The moon was up, Campbell said. 3/4, going on full. You could see a man's shape at that distance. He stepped back from the window. You could see he was riding hard and wearing a long coat. Whether you could say with certainty whose coat it was is a different question. It's the only question. Irene Galloway's cafe was closed. The eat sign turned to its blank side. Campbell knocked twice before she answered. When she did, she held the door only partway open, and the bruise on the left side of her face told most of the story before she said a word. It was a bad one, deep purple at the cheekbone, swelling the eye half shut, the kind of bruise that had been put there by a closed fist with intent behind it. Irene, Campbell said. I'm fine. You're not. He kept his voice even. I need to come in. She stepped back and he entered. The cafe was dim, chairs still up on the tables from the night before. She moved to the counter and stood behind it the way she stood during service hours, the counter between her and the room like a boundary she'd chosen. When did you see Eastston last? Campbell said. Last night. She touched the bruise with 2 fingers, then dropped her hand. He came here after supper. He'd been drinking. What did he want? She held his gaze for a long beat, measuring something. He wanted me to sign a paper. About the cafe property. He said he owned the building I've been renting for 3 years, and that he was selling it. He wanted me to sign a document agreeing to vacate. And you refused. I told him I needed to read it first. He didn't want me to read it. She reached under the counter and produced a folded document, several pages, and set it on the wood between them. He left it when he left. He wasn't pleased about that, either. Campbell took the document without unfolding it. Did he strike you before or after he left? Before. No hesitation. I told him to get out of my cafe. He made a point. Then he left. And after he left, I locked the door and sat down for a while. She kept her voice steady, though it cost her. Then I cleaned up and went to bed. Did you see anyone else last night? Anyone outside? No. Campbell folded the document and put it in his coat. He held her gaze, not the direct assault of an interrogation, but the steady attention of a man who is telling someone they don't have to manage alone. Irene. If there's anything else. There isn't. The words came out quick and certain, the quickness itself a kind of answer. Then softer, is he really dead? Yes. She took that in. Something shifted behind her eyes, not relief, not grief, something more complicated than either, the expression of a person whose problem has been solved in a way they hadn't wanted and can't undo. Then I need to open the cafe, she said. People will be coming in to talk about it. Campbell stepped back from the counter. At the door he stopped. The document he brought, he said. Did Larry Venttor know about it? The pause lasted exactly 2 seconds. Larry knows most of what happens to me, she said. Eventually. Campbell went out into the morning. The street was beginning to fill. Word traveled in a small town the way fire travels in dry grass, faster than any single person carries it. He could see it in the way men stood in doorways talking, in the clusters forming outside the hardware store and the two-spot. He needed to find Larry Venttor before someone else did. He needed to find him considerably before Tom Linton did. Chapter 7. Larry Venttor was not at Hog Hollow. Campbell rode the 7 miles at a lope and found the homestead shuttered and still, the horse corral empty, the kitchen garden already giving itself back to the deer. A tin cup sat on the porch railing, with an inch of cold coffee in it, which meant he'd left in a hurry or hadn't planned to be gone long. Either way, he was gone. He found him 2 hours later, in the back room of the two-spot, where Frank the barman kept a cot for when the weather turned bad and the road out of town became impassable. Larry was sitting on the edge of the cot, with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he'd been there long enough that the cold had gotten into the room without him noticing. He didn't resist the arrest. He stood when Campbell told him to stand, held out his wrists for the cuffs without being asked, and walked the 3 blocks to the jail with his eyes on the ground in front of him. Campbell unlocked the cell, and Larry went in and sat on the bunk and put his face back in his hands, and that was the last voluntary thing he did for a considerable while. The jail held 2 cells side by side, separated by a plank wall with a barred window cut through it. The front cell stood empty. Larry occupied the rear one, which got afternoon light through a slit window set high in the adobe, too narrow for a man's shoulders and too high for anything else. Bailey had built this jail himself 17 years ago, and he'd built it with the intention that things put inside it would stay inside it. Campbell pulled a chair to the cell door and sat with his arms across his knees. "Tell me where you were last night," he said. Larry said nothing. "I'm not asking because I think you did it. I'm asking because somebody did, and whoever it was took some trouble to make it look like you." He let that settle. Lee Bell put you at the Three Deuces at the time of the shooting. A coat matching yours, riding hard away from the gate. Larry's hands tightened on each other. That was all. Larry. If you were somewhere else, anywhere else, that's your defense. Give me a name, a place, something I can put in front of Bailey. Silence. The afternoon light moved across the cell floor in a slow diagonal. Was it Irene? Campbell said. Were you with Irene Galloway? Larry's head came up. His eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of a man who'd moved past what tears could do. Leave her out of this. She's already in it. Eastston struck her last night, before he drove out to the ranch. Did you know that when it happened, or did you find out after? Something crossed Larry's face, a fast involuntary thing there and gone. Anger, or the memory of anger, or something colder than either. Leave her alone, he said. I can't. Not if she's your alibi. Not if she knows something that keeps you off the gallows. Campbell kept his voice level and his position easy in the chair. I'm trying to help you, Larry. But you have to give me something to work with. Larry Venttor lay down on the bunk and faced the wall, and the conversation was over. Tom Linton arrived at Bailey's office at 4 in the afternoon with his attorney's bag and the air of a man attending to a matter that had been too long neglected. He wore a black coat appropriate to the gravity of the occasion and had combed his hair with particular care, and he set his bag on Bailey's desk as though the desk were his own. The circuit judge can be in Palos, Duros by Wednesday, he said. I've already sent the telegraph. Bailey sat behind the desk with his pipe and his patience. The investigation is 2 days old, Tom. The evidence is not complicated. We have an eyewitness placing Venttor at the scene. We have his established grievance with the deceased. We have a cook who saw a man in a coat, Bailey said. At 100 yards. In the dark. The moon was up. Lee Bell is a credible witness with no reason to fabricate. Campbell stood near the gun rack and said nothing. He'd learned in the past weeks that the most useful position in this office was the one Linton had the least reason to account for. Lee Bell has every reason to fabricate, Bailey said. He worked for Gene Eastston. He may still work for whoever inherits the Three Deuces. Linton's expression didn't change. It never changed in the way a mask doesn't change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. That's an extraordinary accusation. It's an ordinary observation. Bailey set his pipe down. I've been a lawman in this territory for 22 years, and I've never yet seen a case where the evidence lined up this clean this fast. Clean evidence, in my experience, means someone spent time arranging it. Or it means the crime was straightforward. Then Wednesday will come, and the judge will hear it, and it'll sort itself out. Bailey picked the pipe back up. I won't be rushed, Tom. Not on a hanging charge. Linton held Bailey's gaze for a long moment. Then he retrieved his bag from the desk with a small, precise motion that managed to convey disagreement without expressing it, and left. Campbell waited until the sound of his boots on the boardwalk had faded. He's already spoken to the judge, he said. Almost certainly. Bailey fired a match and touched it to the pipe bowl. He sent that telegraph before he came here. This visit was to find out how much I know, not to tell me what he's done. What do you know? Less than I need. The old sheriff pulled on the pipe and let the smoke go. Go back to the Three Deuces. Look at that crime scene again, in daylight. Then talk to Lee Bell a second time. Don't tell him you're coming. A man tells a rehearsed story the same way twice. A man telling the truth tells it different each time because he's remembering, not reciting. The buggy was still at the north gate when Campbell rode out, though someone had unhitched the horse and the vehicle sat alone in the scrub like something abandoned. He tied the roan to the gate post and worked the ground around the buggy for an hour, moving in careful concentric circles, marking what he found against what he'd found at dawn. The boot prints he'd noted that morning were still there, the close set at the buggy step, the smaller set from the ranch road direction. In the morning, he'd read them as sequential. Now, crouching over the smaller set and tracing their angle and depth, he revised that. The smaller prints bore the weight of someone who'd been standing still, not arriving. The heel impressions were deeper than the toes. Someone had stood at the front wheel for several minutes, carrying something, or holding something, or watching. A witness. Or a second party to the thing itself. He measured the distance between the two sets of prints with his spread hand, 3 hand spans roughly 2 feet. Close enough to speak quietly. Far enough apart that they hadn't arrived together. He was still crouching over the ground when he heard hoofbeats on the ranch road and looked up to find one of the 3 deuces hands pulling up at the gate. The man was older than most of the crew, with a gray beard and a steady seat in the saddle. "Deputy," the man said. He made no move to come through the gate. "Lee Bell sent word you'd be coming out." Campbell straightened up. "Did he?" "Said to tell you, if you had more questions about last night, you should put them in writing to Mr. Linton's office. Mr. Linton is handling all matters related to Mr. Easton's estate." The man delivered it without apology or embarrassment, the way a man delivers a message he had no part in composing. "When did Linton take over the estate?" Campbell said. "I couldn't say. Yesterday sometime." Campbell untied the roan and mounted. "Tell Bell I appreciate the message." The hand nodded and held his position at the gate. Riding back toward town, Campbell turned it over. Linton moving onto the estate within 24 hours of Easton's death. Lee Bell suddenly communicating through Linton's office. A story that matched the physical evidence too precisely, as though the story had been built to fit the evidence rather than the other way around. Most damning of all, Larry Venttor, who had every reason to defend himself, sitting in a jail cell, facing the gallows, and refusing to say a single word that might save his life. People kept secrets for 2 reasons: fear, or to protect someone else. Campbell had enough experience with both to know which one he was dealing with here. The question was whose name Larry Venttor was protecting, and whether Campbell could find that out before Wednesday put a judge on the bench and Tom Linton in front of him. Chapter 8. It happened between 2 and 3 in the morning, in the dead stretch of night, when even the 2 spot had gone quiet, and the only light on the main street came from the lamp Bailey kept burning in the jail office. Oakes was on night duty. He was not a heavy sleeper by nature, but he was 53 years old, and the chair in the jail office had a way of working on a man after midnight, and when Campbell arrived at 6 to relieve him, Oakes was in that chair with his chin on his chest and the cold lamp on the desk beside him and the rear cell standing empty. Campbell stood in the cell doorway for a moment, taking inventory. The bunk was pushed 6 inches from the wall, moved deliberately, not just slept on. On the floor beneath the slit window, a scattering of adobe dust and 2 small chips of the window's lower sill. Outside the window, 8 feet up the exterior wall, someone had dragged a crate or a box and stood on it to reach the sill. On the bunk, where a pillow might have been, lay a Smith & Wesson double-action revolver, pearl-handled, the ivory grips worn smooth with use. Fully loaded. Someone had wrapped it in a flour sack to muffle the passage through the window bars. The sacking lay beside it, unfolded. Campbell crouched and studied the gun without picking it up. Pearl grips on a working revolver were an affectation, the choice of a man who wanted to be remembered or wanted to be feared. He'd seen one gun like this before, carried by a deputy marshal out of El Paso who'd cultivated a reputation as carefully as other men cultivated land. That marshal had ended badly. Most men who carried guns like this one did. He went to wake Bailey. The old sheriff dressed fast and came to the jail without a word, and stood in the cell and took the scene apart piece by piece the way he'd done 10,000 times. He didn't touch the gun either. He crouched over the adobe dust on the floor, then went outside and found the crate, a dry goods box from the mercantile, the stenciling still fresh, and stood on it himself to gauge the angle to the window. "Whoever stood here was shorter than me," Bailey said. "And they done it before or scouted it first. You don't find the right angle in the dark on the first try. Oaks hear anything?" "Oaks?" Bailey stepped off the crate. "I'll talk to Oaks. But if Oaks heard something and didn't act on it, that's one problem. And if Oaks didn't hear anything, that's a different problem. And right now I can't tell you which one I have." "The horse," Campbell said. "Yes. They found it by asking Pruitt at the livery, who'd been up since 4 with a colicky mare, and had seen a saddled dun quarter horse tied to the post behind the church at some point before midnight. A good horse, he said, not a scrub, with a new saddle on it, and nobody he recognized holding the reins or anywhere nearby. "Who boards a dun quarter horse with you?" Campbell said. Pruitt scratched the back of his neck. "3 Deuces keeps 3 or 4 duns. But they're on the ranch. Nobody from out there has boarded here since Jorgensen. And Jorgensen," he stopped. "Jorgensen boarded a dun here? Before he was killed. Kept a private horse here, separate from the ranch remuda. Nice animal. After he died, it got claimed by one of the other hands. He thought about it. Bald-faced dun with a right hind sock. That's the one I saw tied behind the church." Bailey and Campbell looked at each other across the livery aisle. "Someone from the 3 Deuces," Bailey said. "Someone who knew Jorgensen's horse well enough to take it without anyone raising a question. Campbell turned it. Or someone who was given it." Bailey convened what passed for a meeting in his office. Himself, Campbell, and Oaks, who sat in the corner chair with the particular stillness of a man braced for an accusation. "Tell it," Bailey said. Oaks told it. He'd been awake until around 1, he thought. He'd heard nothing specific, some movement from the rear cell around midnight that he'd put down to Venttor's shifting on the bunk, which prisoners did. No voices. No sound from outside the building. When he woke at 6, Campbell was standing in the office. Bailey listened without any shift in his face. When Oaks finished, the old sheriff looked at the wall above Oaks's head for a long moment, which told Campbell more than anything Bailey might have said. "Go home," Bailey told Oaks. "Don't talk to anyone about this. Not Linton's people, not 3 Deuces' hands, not your wife. No one." Oaks left. Campbell waited until his footsteps cleared the boardwalk outside. "You think he's lying," Campbell said. "I think he's scared." Bailey brought his pipe out and set it on the desk without lighting it. "Those are different things, and sometimes they look the same." He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Whoever arranged this had information about the jail routine. The shift change. The window. The crate from the mercantile. That didn't appear in the night. It was placed in the afternoon sometime, when nobody thinks to notice a dry goods box against a wall. Someone who's been in this jail. Or has a reason to know how it runs. Linton has been in this office 6 times in the past month." Bailey's voice carried no heat in it. "Just wait. He uses the necessary facilities when he visits. Those facilities are in the back, past the cells." Campbell took that in and held it. "You want me to go after Larry," he said. "I want you to track him." Bailey stood and moved to the window, his back to Campbell, his hands clasped behind him. "There's a difference. A man tracking a fugitive rides hard and brings him back fast. A man who understands the situation takes his time and sees what the country shows him." He turned. "I think someone arranged this escape not to free Larry Venttor, but to put him somewhere he can be killed quietly and have it laid to a posse's gun, or a tracker's gun, or simple bad luck in rough country. The room went very still. "They want him dead," Campbell said. "They want him silent. Dead accomplishes that cleanly." Bailey picked up his pipe and held it. Whatever Larry Venttor knows, whatever he's protecting by refusing to speak, someone believes he'll eventually say it. A jail cell with a judge coming Wednesday concentrates a man's mind. But a man running for Mexico in the Badlands, with guns behind him. He won't make it to Mexico. Not if the wrong people find him first. Bailey put the pipe between his teeth, unlit. "I'm sending you because you're the one person in this valley whose loyalties Linton hasn't had time to buy or establish. I need you to find Larry before anyone else does. Talk to him. Find out what he knows and who he's protecting, and get it back to me. And if I find him in bad country with no witness, and someone decides what happens out there is between me and the terrain, then you'll need to be better than whoever they send." Bailey said it without drama, as a condition of employment. He came around the desk and put his hand on Campbell's shoulder briefly, a rare thing, contact from the old man, and Campbell registered it as such. "There's more to this than what's on the surface, son. A great deal more. Keep your eyes open and trust what they show you, not what you're told to see." He removed his hand and went back to his desk and picked up the morning's paperwork, as though the conversation had concluded, which it had. Campbell went to the livery, saddled the roan, checked his rifle and his revolver and the contents of his saddlebags, and rode south out of Palos, Duros, into the early heat. Somewhere in the Badlands between the valley floor and the Mexican border, Larry Venttor was running. And somewhere behind Campbell, he had the steady conviction, someone was already saddling a horse. Chapter 9. The sinks began 20 miles south of Palos, Duros, where the valley floor fractured and dropped into a geography that had no interest in being navigated. Erosion had done its work over centuries, cutting the red limestone into a labyrinth of canyons that ran east-west and north-south, and sometimes in directions that had no name, dead-ending without warning into walls of stone or opening without logic into broader flats that looked like exits and led nowhere. Local men called the whole formation the sinks, because things went into it and didn't come back the same way they went in. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. Campbell had been riding since sunrise. The heat by mid-morning came off the canyon walls in waves that bent the air above the rock into something liquid and untrustworthy. He'd stripped his coat 2 hours back and tied it across the back of the saddle, and still the sweat soaked through his shirt in a wide band across the shoulders. The roan moved with his ears back and his eyes cautious, reading the footing before he committed his weight to it. The trail was there. Larry Venttor rode a dun horse, shod with a distinctive right front shoe that had a small V-shaped nick on the outside edge. Pruitt had told him that when asked. That shoe left a mark Campbell could identify at a walk from the saddle, a small interruption in the otherwise clean arc of the print. He'd been following it since he cut the track 8 miles south of town, where Venttor had left the main road, and angled into the broken country to the west. He'd been following something else, too. It took him until the second hour to be certain. The prints he was tracking ran along a dry stream bed between 2 canyon walls, the ground there being compacted sand that held sign well. A single set of dun horse prints, moving at a trot. Then, at a place where the stream bed curved left around a fall of boulders, he pulled the roan up and dismounted and crouched over a stretch of ground that had been disturbed. Not by passage. By intent. Someone had taken a branch, mesquite, from the broken stub left behind, and swept a 6-foot section of the stream bed in a wide arc. The sweep marks themselves were visible if you knew what you were looking for, fine parallel lines in the sand, the kind a branch makes when dragged. Under the edge of the sweep, where the branch hadn't quite reached, the ghost of a second set of prints ran alongside the dun's tracks. Smaller horse, lighter rider, shod with plain flat shoes. following Venttor's, and covering the evidence of following him. Campbell straightened up and scanned the canyon walls above him in both directions. Nothing moved. A turkey vulture tilted on a thermal somewhere high above the south wall, too far up to mean anything immediate. The canyon held its silence the way stone holds cold, absolutely without apology. He remounted and rode on, slower now, reading both trails instead of one. The second instance of sweeping came a mile further in, where the streambed split around a rock formation, and the Dun's tracks went right. The sweep here was more thorough. Whoever held the branch had been at it longer, working back from the split to obscure which fork the following horse had taken. But they'd been working against time, and time had not cooperated. At the far edge of the swept section, in a thin strip of wind-blown sand that had settled after the sweep, two fresh prints of the smaller horse cut clean and sharp, going right. Campbell went right. The canyon narrowed as he rode deeper into it, the walls closing from 30 feet apart to 20 to 12, the strip of sky above shrinking to a pale ribbon. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shade. The roan's hooves rang off the stone floor, and the sound came back off the walls doubled and distorted, so that Campbell couldn't tell anymore whether he was hearing his own horse or something else. He stopped. He sat without moving for a full 2 minutes, letting the horse stand and the canyon settle around him. From somewhere ahead came a sound so faint, it might have been water or wind or the scrape of a hoof on stone. He couldn't place the distance. In narrow rock, the acoustics played tricks that could kill a man who trusted them. He backed the roan 10 feet to a widening in the canyon wall, a shallow alcove where the rock had crumbled inward, and dismounted and tied him to a jut of limestone. He pulled the Winchester from the scabbard, worked the lever to be certain of the round in the chamber, and went forward on foot. The canyon bent left 20 feet ahead. He went to the inside of the bend, keeping his left shoulder near the wall, moving his boots with care on the broken rock. At the bend he went low, and put his head around the corner at knee height, where no one aiming at head height would account for it. The canyon opened ahead into a small flat, maybe 40 feet across, rimmed on 3 sides by vertical walls. A natural trap. Or a natural meeting place, depending on what you intended. Empty. But not recently empty. In the center of the flat, the sand held the overlapping prints of 2 horses, the dun and the smaller animal, circling each other at close quarters. Boot prints from 2 different men. A cold fire ring, ash-gray and scattered, with 3 scorched stones around it. 2 of the stones had been moved since the fire was built, dragged into new positions, not kicked. Someone had built that fire, and someone else had found it afterward and pulled the stones apart. Campbell crouched at the fire ring and pressed his palm flat to the ash. Cold. But not the deep cold of days. Hours, maybe. Last night. He read the boot prints around the ring. The larger set, Venttor's or someone his size, had stood at the north edge of the flat, shifting weight, pacing a short line back and forth, the kind of movement that meant waiting. The smaller set came in from the east entry, stood near the fire ring for a time, and went back the way they'd come without circling the flat. A meeting. Or an attempted meeting that had gone wrong. And then at the western wall, something he hadn't seen at first, because it was at eye level when standing, and he'd come in low. Scratched into the limestone with what looked like a belt buckle or a spur rowel, cut shallow but clear enough to read in the flat light. Not safe here, go North Fork wait. Campbell read it twice. North Fork of what was the question? There were a dozen North Forks in the sinks, but whoever scratched it had been in a hurry and counting on the reader to know what they meant. He went back to the roan, and sat in the alcove and thought it through. Someone had followed Venttor's into the sinks, and swept his own tracks to hide the following. That same person had met Venttor's at this flat, or tried to, and left a message on the wall. The message carried warning, not threat. Not safe here. The person who wrote that knew what was coming behind them both. Which meant a third party in this country. A third horse, somewhere in the sinks that Campbell had not yet found sign of. He went back to the flat and cast wider, working the perimeter of the walls. On the south entry, hidden under a lip of overhanging rock, he found them, 3 sets of prints, horses standing, the men off them. The horses had been held there for some time. Cigarette ends ground into the dirt, 4 of them. Someone who smoked and someone who didn't, standing with a third man's horse. 3 men. Waiting at the south approach, while someone met Venttors at the fire ring and scratched a warning on the wall. Campbell sat back on his heels. The arithmetic of it assembled itself against his will, each piece fitting the next with the clean logic of something pre-arranged rather than accidental. Venttor's escapes through a jail window with a pearl-handled gun, nobody claims. A horse from Jorgensen's string, conveniently placed. A tracker, Campbell, sent south into the sinks. And somewhere ahead of the tracker, 3 men with horses who have been waiting long enough to smoke 4 cigarettes in the shade. This was not a manhunt. It was a corridor. And Campbell was somewhere inside it, heading in the direction they wanted him to head. He stood and walked back to the roan, and stood with his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of him and the faint tremor of the canyon wind in his mane. And he thought about Bailey's hand on his shoulder and the weight behind the old man's words. Trust what your eyes show you, not what you're told to see. He'd been told to track south. The tracks went south. He turned the roan north. Chapter 10. He rode back into Palos Duros in the middle of the afternoon, coming in from the south road with 2 days of canyon dust on him, and a set of conclusions he needed to test against something other than his own reasoning. The main street was quiet in the heat, a dog in the shade of the feed store porch, 2 horses at the 2-spot rail, a woman in a bonnet who crossed from the dry goods to the post office without looking up. He put the horse at the livery and walked to the cafe. The Eat sign was turned to its open face. Through the window, he could see Irene Galloway at the far end of the counter, writing in a ledger, her head bent over the work. He went in. The lunch crowd had come and gone, and left the usual evidence. Rings on the counter from coffee cups, a chair pushed back at an angle, the smell of fried meat still in the warm air. One old man with a beard worked through a piece of pie at the corner table, with the focused devotion of a man for whom pie had become the day's primary event. He didn't look up. Irene heard the door and straightened and closed the ledger before she turned. The bruise had gone to yellow-green at the edges, the deep purple fading toward the color of an old map. The swelling was down, but the eye was still slightly narrowed by it. She'd done nothing to hide it, no powder, no arrangement of her hair. Either she didn't care, or she decided concealment was a form of permission she wasn't prepared to grant. "You're back," she said. "Rode in an hour ago." Campbell took the stool nearest the door, not at the counter, just inside the threshold, giving her the room between them as a statement of intent. "I need to ask you some things." "I figured." She set the ledger under the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and brought them over, setting one in front of him and holding her own. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." "Did you find Larry?" "No." He turned the cup on the saucer, not drinking it yet. "Someone was ahead of me in the sinks. 3 men waiting. It wasn't a search party." She absorbed that. A small shift in her posture, barely visible, the shoulders dropping a fraction, weight redistributing, the body acknowledging what the face tried not to. "Is he alive?" she said. "I think so." Someone was helping him, leaving a trail he could follow that the 3 men wouldn't read. Whoever it was knew the country. He left a space there, deliberate. "You know anyone who moves through the sinks like that?" "No." Too quick, but not a lie, he read the difference. She didn't know a name. She knew enough to be afraid of the question. He let it go and came at the thing from a different angle. Tell me about Gene Easton's business. Irene set her cup down. I ran a cafe. I wasn't his bookkeeper. You talked to him 3 times a week for 4 months. Men who want to impress a woman talk about themselves. Specifically, they talk about their money, because that's what they think you want to hear. He kept his voice even. What did Easton talk about? She moved back along the counter, not fleeing, just creating distance while she thought about it, the counter's edge under her hands, her weight shifting from one foot to the other. He talked about land, she said finally. Always land. What he'd acquired, what he was acquiring, what he intended to acquire. The 3 Deuces wasn't the end of it for him, it was the foundation. He wanted the whole South Range eventually. He had plans drawn. Linton's plans? The reaction was small but clear, a tightening around her eyes, the coffee cup coming up to a position that put something between her and the question. Linton handled everything legal, she said. Contracts. Deeds. Disputes. Gene trusted him completely. She said, trusted in the past tense, without appearing to notice she'd done it. Linton had been with him since before the 3 Deuces, from back in Tucson. Easton ever talk about money trouble? No. Ever mention being surprised, by his own accounts? Numbers that didn't match what he expected. She set the cup down. Something moved in her face, a recognition or the memory of one, rising from somewhere she'd been keeping it. Once, she said. Maybe 6 weeks before he died. He came in for supper and he was, not himself. Quiet, in a way he normally wasn't. He'd had something in his coat pocket he kept taking out and putting back. Papers of some kind. Did he say what they were? I asked him if something was wrong. He said. She stopped. Picked up a cloth from the counter and folded it, then unfolded it, the hands needing something to do. He said he'd found out that a man could steal from you for years, and you'd never see it if you trusted the man enough to let him keep the books. Campbell held that. He said it like that. Those words. Close enough. I remember because it struck me. Gene Easton wasn't a man who talked that way. He talked about what he owned, and what he was going to own. He didn't talk about being cheated. She put the cloth down flat on the counter. He was frightened. I didn't understand it at the time, because I hadn't ever seen him frightened before. He was the kind of man who, she caught herself. He didn't frighten easily. And that evening, he was frightened. Did he say who? No. And I didn't ask because I thought. A long breath out, her gaze going to the window and the empty street beyond it. I thought if I asked directly, he'd close up, the way he always did when I got too near whatever he kept private. So I let it pass. 2 days later, he was dead. She turned back. If I'd pushed him that night. You couldn't have known, Campbell said. No. The word came out flat and without comfort. She wasn't asking to be absolved, and she wasn't going to be satisfied by reassurance. He respected that. Irene. He waited until her eyes came to his. The document he brought you the night he died. The one about the cafe property. I gave it to you. I know. Linton drew it up. The notarization date is 3 weeks before Easton was killed. Which means Linton had that document prepared 3 weeks before Easton apparently decided to use it. He let that land. You understand what that means? She understood. He could see her understanding it, working through the implications the way a person works through something they've been trying not to see clearly, each step deliberate and unwelcome. Linton was moving assets, she said. Before Easton was dead. Before Easton knew he was going to be dead. The cafe was very quiet. Outside, a wagon went past on the street, the driver calling something to someone on the boardwalk, A brief, ordinary sound from a world going about its business without knowledge of what was being said in this room. "I can't testify to any of this," Irene said. "I don't have anything solid. What I have is a frightened man eating supper and saying something I didn't understand until just now." "I know." Campbell stood. "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking you to stay in town and stay visible, and not take any trips or close the cafe or do anything that would give someone reason to think you know more than you do." "I do know more than I do." "Yes. But they don't know that yet." He moved toward the door. "They will, eventually. That's why staying ordinary is what keeps you safe right now." She came around the counter to the near end. "Campbell." He stopped. "The night Eastston died. After he struck me and left, her jaw set in the way of someone overriding their own resistance. Someone came to the back door. Not long after. I didn't answer it. I heard whoever it was try the handle, and then they went away." Campbell turned back fully. "Man or woman?" he said. "I couldn't tell. Boots on the step. Light tread. You didn't see them?" "No. I was sitting in the dark in the kitchen, and I didn't light a lamp because I didn't want anyone to know I was there." Her voice was even, recounting it like inventory. "Whoever it was stood at the door long enough to try the handle twice. Then they went around to the front, and I heard them on the boardwalk, and then nothing." "How long after Eastston left?" 20 minutes. Perhaps a little more." Campbell put that against the timeline of the night and felt things shift into a new arrangement. Not complete, not yet, but the shape of something becoming visible the way a landscape emerges from fog, feature by feature, nothing sudden about it. "Why didn't you tell Bailey this?" he said. "Because I don't know what it means." "And because," she met his gaze straight without apology, "because the people in this town who are afraid to talk have reasons for being afraid, and I'm not so certain I'm not one of them." He had nothing useful to say to that, because she was right. He went out into the heat of the afternoon, and the door settled shut behind him. Not swung, just closed, the way things close when there's no drama left in them. He needed Linton's office. He needed it tonight, in the dark, without anyone's permission. Chapter 11. Linton's office occupied the second floor of a building on the east side of the main street, above a land surveyor who kept hours that ended at 5, and a side entrance on the alley that the surveyor used when he didn't want to be seen going in or out. Campbell had noted the side entrance 3 weeks ago, and filed it the way he filed things that might be useful later. Later was now. He waited until past midnight. He sat in his room at Mrs. Teller's with his boots off and the lamp unlit, listening to the street go quiet in stages, the two-spot last, its piano dying by degrees, then silence except for the wind off the desert finding its way between the buildings. He gave it another half hour after that. The alley ran behind the east side buildings, unpaved, too narrow for a wagon, used primarily by the building's backdoor commerce and by cats. He came down Mrs. Teller's back stair and crossed 2 lots of bare ground and entered the alley from the north end, staying close to the wall on the building side. No moon yet. The stars gave enough light to navigate by, but not enough for faces, which was fine. He didn't need faces. The side entrance was a plain plank door with a standard rim lock, the kind a man who wasn't expecting trouble would install, and a man who understood locks could open in under 2 minutes with the right tools. Campbell had spent 3 years before the Rangers learning skills that the Rangers found useful, and his mother had found alarming. He worked the picks by feel in the dark, his ear near the keyhole, counting the pins. 1 minute 40 seconds. The door swung inward onto a staircase going up. He went up it with one hand trailing the wall, testing each step before committing his weight, climbing in near silence to the landing at the top. A second door, this one unlocked. Linton trusted his street-level lock and nothing beyond it, which told Campbell something about the man's confidence. Either he believed no one in Palos Duros would dare, or he kept nothing in this office worth protecting. Campbell was betting on the first. The office was one large room, divided by a low railing into a waiting area and a working area. In the working area, a desk, a typewriter on a side table, a tall oak filing cabinet with 4 drawers, 2 chairs, and along the back wall, a floor-to-ceiling bookcase holding law volumes, and a row of identical black ledger books, 9 of them standing in a line at eye height. Campbell crossed to the bookcase and pulled the first ledger. He couldn't risk a lamp. He went to the window that faced the alley, not the street window, the alley side, where no late pedestrian would register a moving light, and angled the ledger to catch what starlight came through the glass. It wasn't much. Enough. The first ledger covered 1883 and 1884, the early years of the Three Deuces. Ranch revenues and expenditures, neatly columned in a precise hand that he already recognized from the documents Irene had given him. Linton's figures, not Easton's. Linton had kept these books himself, which was either trust or control, and in Campbell's experience, those two things in a business relationship were rarely the same. He pulled the most recent ledger, 1886 through the present. He found it in March of the previous year, buried between 2 ordinary entries, a hay purchase and a farrier's bill, where someone doing a quick review would skip over it as routine. A transfer of $600 to an account identified only by a number. No name, no payee, no explanation of service rendered. He ran his finger down the column. Found another in April. 800. May, 600 again. The amounts varied, but the account number stayed the same, appearing every 4 to 6 weeks without fail, always between legitimate entries, always without annotation. He counted them back to March of 1885. 31 transfers over 19 months. He did the arithmetic in his head, running the column twice to be certain. $9,400, drawn from Three Deuces operating accounts, and sent to a numbered account that appeared nowhere else in the ledgers, had no corresponding receipt anywhere in the files, and was recorded in Linton's hand alone. $9,400 was more than most men in Shotgun Valley would see in a decade. He put the ledger back precisely as he'd found it, and pulled the filing cabinet's second drawer, which held correspondence files in hanging folders. He worked through them by touch and starlight, reading the tab labels. Ranch contracts, grazing agreements, water rights, deed transfers, 6 of them, each one a former small rancher who'd sold out to the Three Deuces, all drawn by Linton, all bearing Easton's signature and Linton's notary seal. And at the back of the drawer, in a folder with no label, a single page folded once. He angled it to the window. A letter, handwritten, undated. The hand was not Linton's, rounder, less controlled, the letters of a man more comfortable in a saddle than at a desk. He read it twice, committing what he could. It addressed Linton by first name. It referred to an arrangement between them. It mentioned a figure, 20%, and a timeline and a threat folded inside a request, the kind of letter a man writes when he has decided that politeness has run its course and something more direct is required. It was not signed with a full name. Just initials, N.J. Nels Jorgensen. Campbell stood very still in the dark office with that in his hands. Jorgensen had known. Jorgensen had been in on it, or had found out about it, which was a different thing with different consequences. 20% of $9,400 was $1,880, which was a significant sum for a ranch foreman and a significant motive for a great many things, including the particular willingness with which Jorgensen had terrorized the smaller ranchers in the valley. He hadn't just been following orders. He'd been collecting a share. And then Charlie Ventors had shot him in the two-spot, and whatever Jorgensen knew had died with him, except for this letter, sitting in Linton's files because Linton kept everything that could be used against anyone, including a dead man's threat. He was putting the letter back when he heard the street door below. Not the alley entrance. The main street door 1 floor down. The surveyor's door. He stood without moving. Below him, the scrape of the street door across its threshold, then footsteps crossing the lower floor. Not tentative, not searching, but direct and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew where they were going. A faint light appeared at the base of the staircase door, throwing a thin line of yellow across the landing floor. A lamp or a candle. The footsteps started up the stairs. Campbell replaced the unlabeled folder in the back of the second drawer, pressed it shut, and crossed the office to the alley window in 4 steps. The window was a double-hung sash, painted shut on one side, free on the other. He worked the free sash up without rushing it, feeling for the give in the paint seal, easing the wood up millimeter by millimeter. The footsteps reached the landing. The window gave. He went through it feet first, gripping the sill, lowering himself until his arms were at full extension and his boots were 6 feet above the alley floor. He released and took the drop in a crouch, his knees absorbing it, his right hand going to the alley wall to keep his balance. Above him the window sash was still rising, moved by the draft his exit had created. He pressed flat against the wall beneath the window and stayed there. Through the open window, from the office above, came the sound of a drawer sliding open. A long silence. Then the drawer closing. Footsteps crossing the floor. A pause at the filing cabinet. He heard the second drawer open, the one he'd just had his hands in. The sound of hanging folders shifting on their rails. Then nothing for a full minute. Then the footsteps crossed back, and the light diminished, and the stairs took the weight of someone going down. Campbell stayed against the wall until he heard the street door close. Then he moved north along the alley at a walk, not a run. A running man in an alley at 1 in the morning was a story, and a walking man was just a man. He reached the far end, crossed the open ground, came up the back stair of Mrs. Teller's house, and stood in his room in the dark with his coat still on. Someone else had been in that office tonight. Someone who knew where the unlabeled folder lived, and had gone directly to the second drawer without searching any of the others. Someone who knew what was in those files. And who was checking, at 1 in the morning with a lamp, in a building they had no stated business being in, whether it was still there. He took off his coat in the dark, and sat on the edge of the bed and turned it over, and the shape of it assembled itself into something he didn't like at all. Linton wasn't the only one who knew about Jorgensen's letter. Chapter 12. Linton came to find him at the livery. Campbell was at the water trough, washing 2 days of canyon off his face and neck, when he heard the footsteps on the packed earth behind him, and straightened up with the water still dripping off his jaw. Linton stood 6 feet back, his attorney's bag over one shoulder, his expression arranged into the neighborly concern of a man making a social call. "Mr. Campbell. A word, if you have a moment." Campbell dried his face on his shirt sleeve and turned around fully. "Go ahead." "Perhaps somewhere more private." Linton's gaze moved briefly to Pruitt, visible in the barn beyond, then back. "My office, if that suits." "Your office suits fine." They walked the block and a half in the morning heat without speaking. Linton climbed the exterior stair to the second floor, the main stair, not the alley entrance, and unlocked the street-facing door and stood aside. Campbell went in first, which Linton had not expected, and which told Campbell something about what Linton had planned for the arrangement of the room. He took the chair behind the desk. Linton stopped in the middle of the room and processed that for a half-second, then moved to one of the client chairs without comment, and set his bag on the floor beside it and sat down. He crossed one knee over the other, and smoothed the crease in his trousers, and took his time doing it. "Someone broke into this office 2 nights ago," Linton said. "Tell me about it." "The alley window was opened from outside. Nothing was taken, as far as I can determine. But several files in my cabinet were disturbed." He held Campbell's attention with the focused steadiness of a man delivering a prepared statement. "I'm reporting it as a matter of record. Bailey should know. I'll tell him. I'd appreciate your personal attention to it." A brief recalibration in his jaw. "Not tension, something more controlled than tension. Given your investigative background." "My background is in criminal work, not burglary," Campbell said. "Though sometimes they overlap." Linton studied him. "Not the way a man studies something puzzling. The way a man studies something he's trying to value accurately." "Indeed they do," he said. The room held its quiet for a moment. Through the street window came the sound of a wagon on the hardpan below, and a man's voice calling to someone across the street. Ordinary sounds from ordinary commerce, entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. "How is the investigation proceeding?" Linton asked. "The Eastston matter. It's proceeding. Larry Venttor is still at large. For now." Linton uncrossed his knee and leaned forward an inch, elbows on his thighs, his hands loose between them. It was a posture that said candor was coming, and Campbell noted the staging of it. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Campbell. I had reservations when Bailey brought you on. A man with a complicated history, new to the valley, no established relationships. But I've watched you work, and I've revised my thinking." He let that breathe. "You're capable. More capable than Oakes, and considerably more capable than Reardon." "Reardon? Bailey's other deputy?" Linton's eyes held steady. "Bill Reardon. You've met him." "We've crossed paths." Campbell kept his voice level. He'd had 3 brief encounters with Reardon, a lean, cold-eyed man who spoke rarely and always seemed to be somewhere peripheral to the action, near doors, near windows, never quite in the center of anything. What about him? Only that competence deserves recognition. And that when Bailey retires, which he's discussed publicly, the valley will need strong law enforcement leadership. Linton picked up his bag and set it on his knee and opened the clasp with a small, precise click. The Three Deuces estate will require a sheriff who understands the valley's economic interests. A man of that description would find his position well supported. He produced an envelope and set it on the desk between them. "Consider that a token of good faith." Campbell looked at the envelope and left it where it was. "What do you want?" "Focus," Linton said. "Larry Ventor's killed Gene Eastston. The evidence supports it, the eyewitness confirms it, and a fugitive at large is an embarrassment to the law and a disruption to the valley. Bring him in." He paused. "Or don't bring him in. Either outcome closes the matter." Either outcome. Campbell filed those 2 words in a drawer and kept his face neutral. "And the investigation into Eastston's finances." Something moved at the corner of Linton's mouth, too brief and too controlled to call a smile. "Gene Eastston's finances are the concern of his estate, which I administer. Any irregularities in the ranch accounts are a private matter between the estate and its creditors, not a criminal question." He held Campbell's gaze. "Unless someone were to manufacture a criminal angle out of incomplete information, which would be a serious overreach for a deputy operating outside his mandate. And if the investigation into the murder leads into the finances naturally, then we'd have a conversation about jurisdiction and evidence standards." Linton stood, smoothing his coat. "But I don't anticipate that. Because I think you're a man who understands how things actually work, as opposed to how they're supposed to work. That's not cynicism, It's experience. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. The envelope covers 2 months' pay. Think of it as a retainer for future cooperation. I'll think about it, Campbell said. Linton held on him for a 3-count, reading, calculating, arriving at a conclusion Campbell couldn't see. Then he nodded once, the small, contained motion of a man who's made a decision, and left. Campbell stayed in the chair behind the desk and listened to the footsteps go down the external stair and fade into the street. Then he picked up the envelope and turned it in his hands without opening it. Thick currency from the weight of it. He set it back on the desk. The offer was not an offer. It was a diagnosis, Linton determining whether Campbell could be bought, and if so, at what price, and if not, what came next. The promotion framing was courteous wrapping on a threat. Either outcome closes the matter meant that if Campbell brought Larry Venttor's in dead, Linton's problem ended cleanly. If Campbell didn't bring him in at all, Linton had grounds to question his competence and his loyalty to the badge. Either way, the case against Linton closed. Unless Larry talked. Unless Campbell found a way to keep Larry alive long enough to talk. He thought about the intruder in this office 2 nights ago. Linton had reported the break-in with a specificity that told Campbell he'd known exactly what to check. The filing cabinet, the second drawer, the unlabeled folder. He hadn't mentioned what was in the folder. He hadn't needed to. The point of the report was to tell Campbell that the office had been watched, that Linton knew someone had been in it, and that Linton was now watching whoever had been in it. Which meant Linton knew it had been him. Or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to the same thing. Campbell put the envelope in his coat pocket, not to keep it, but because leaving it on Linton's desk was information he wasn't ready to give. He went down the alley stair, the one he'd used 2 nights ago, and walked north toward Bailey's office. The morning felt different now. Not in any way he could point to precisely. Same street, same buildings, same heat building off the Caliche. But the geometry of it had changed. He'd been a deputy, running down a lead. Now he was a man that a murderer had decided to buy or neutralize. And the distance between those 2 positions was the distance between being useful and being a problem. And problems in Linton's world had a way of resolving themselves through Reardon. He needed Bailey. And he needed to tell Bailey about Reardon before Reardon became aware that Campbell was thinking about him. He crossed the street at an angle, not looking back, and went through Bailey's door at a pace that was not quite urgent and not quite ordinary, which was the pace of a man who has just understood that the clock he's been working against has been running faster than he thought. Chapter 13. Bailey was at his desk with a map of Shotgun Valley spread open under his hands when Campbell walked in. Not one of the county survey maps from the filing cabinet, an older one, hand-drawn on linen, the kind that predated the territorial surveys and showed the valley as it had been before the ranches divided it. He had it weighted at the corners with a coffee mug, an ash tin, a book, and his pipe. He didn't look up when Campbell entered. He pointed at the chair across the desk without raising his eyes from the map. Campbell sat. "Linton came to see me this morning," Bailey said. He traced something on the map with one finger. The South Range, the Hog Hollow Basin, the 3 Deuces boundaries penciled in Bailey's hand, on top of the original cartography. Reported a break-in at his office. Said files were disturbed but nothing taken. I heard. Now Bailey looked up. He held Campbell across the desk for a long moment, not a question in it, not an accusation. Something more like an audit. Then he went back to the map. He wanted me to assign Reardon to investigate, Bailey said. I told him I'd handle it personally. Reardon. Campbell kept both his voice and his posture level. Tell me about Reardon. Bailey sat back from the map and folded his arms across his chest. He was quiet for a stretch that had weight in it, not reluctance, more the way a man organizes something complicated before he speaks it aloud. Bill Reardon came to me 14 months ago with a letter of recommendation from a deputy marshal in El Paso, Bailey said. The letter was genuine. The marshal knew him. What the marshal didn't include, what I found out 3 months later from a man who'd worked with Reardon in the Panhandle, was that Reardon had been let go from 2 previous positions for conduct that never quite rose to dismissal on its merits, but that everyone who'd worked near him understood was wrong. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He follows orders. He doesn't ask what they're for. He does what he's paid to do, and he does it without leaving residue. Those qualities are useful to a man like Linton. He arranged the jailbreak, Campbell said. Almost certainly. The pearl-handled gun was Jorgensen's. Jorgensen collected them, had 2 or 3 that I knew of. After Jorgensen died, his personal effects went to the 3 Deuces, which Linton now administers. Bailey picked up the ash tin from the map corner and set it on the desk. The dun horse. The dry goods crate against the wall. Oakes conveniently sleeping through the window. He set the tin down with a small, precise click. Reardon could have arranged every one of those things without Linton ever being in the same room with any of them. And the 3 men in the sinks. Bailey's eyes came back to him sharply. Tell me. Campbell told him. The swept tracks, the fire flat, the scratched message on the limestone wall, the 4 cigarette ends under the overhang. Bailey listened without interruption, his arms still crossed, his chin dropped slightly, the posture of a man running what he hears against what he already knows and checking for fit. When Campbell finished, Bailey unfolded his arms and pressed both palms flat on the map. Someone helped Larry out of the sinks, he said. Someone tried to. Whether they succeeded. If those 3 men had found Larry first, we'd have heard about it. A fugitive dead in rough country, shot by unknown parties, that's the kind of news that arrives fast. Bailey shook his head once. Larry's alive. Someone moved him. Who knows the sinks well enough to navigate it in the dark, and cover sign doing it? 3 or 4 men in this valley. Bailey was quiet for a moment. Then Charlie. Campbell felt that land. Charlie Venttors, running for Mexico. Not running, waiting somewhere south of the border, in contact with someone in Palos, Duros, who could tell him where his brother was and what was coming for him. Charlie came back, Campbell said. Or never made it across. Bailey pushed up from the desk and moved to the small window that faced the alley. His back to the room now, his hands clasped behind him, watching whatever the alley offered by way of thinking space. Here's what I know and what I think. I'll tell you the difference between the 2. Campbell waited. What I know, Linton has been moving money out of the 3 Deuces accounts for at least 2 years. I've suspected it since early last year, when a rancher named Aldridge sold his spread to Eastston for less than half its value, and left the valley 2 weeks later. Aldridge was not a man who sold cheap or left without reason. He was 3rd generation on that land. I started asking questions, and the questions led to Linton's books, which I couldn't access legally without cause. He turned from the window. What I think Eastston found out. Linton killed him before Eastston could act on what he'd found. Lee Bell was paid to provide the witness account, and Venttor's was chosen as the frame because he had established motive, no alibi, and a brother who just killed Linton's foreman. That's almost exactly what happened, Campbell said. Bailey absorbed that without expression. How much of it can you prove? The transfers are in the ledger. 31 entries over 19 months, $9,400 to an account with no name attached. He watched Bailey register the number. There's also a letter. In Linton's files, in a folder with no label. Jorgensen's handwriting, I'm near certain of it. Addressed to Linton by first name. references an arrangement, a 20% figure, and makes a demand that stops just short of a threat. Jorgensen knew about the embezzlement. Jorgensen was sharing in it, or extorting a share. The letter reads like a man who'd been getting his cut and decided he wanted more. Campbell shifted in the chair. When Charlie Venttor shot Jorgensen in the 2 spot, he didn't just kill Linton's foreman. He killed the one man who could have tied Linton to the money. The letter is what's left. Bailey picked up his pipe from the map corner and held it cold. He carried it to his chair and sat and turned it in his hands, the way he handled problems Campbell had come to understand, working the object while the mind worked the problem. The letter stays in Linton's files because Linton keeps every piece of leverage he's ever had, Bailey said. It's not evidence against him, it's insurance. If anyone ever finds it and reads it as blackmail material against Linton, Linton produces a counter-story, and Jorgensen is still dead and can't dispute it. He set the pipe on the desk. To use it against Linton, we need context. We need someone who can speak to what Jorgensen knew and when. Irene, Campbell said. Irene. Bailey nodded once, the slow nod of a man confirming what he already believed. She knows more than she's told either of us. I don't think she's lying. I think she's frightened, and she's sorting through what's safe to say and what isn't. He fixed Campbell with a direct, unadorned look that Campbell had come to recognize as Bailey at his most serious. She needs protecting. Not visible. If Linton sees a deputy camped on her doorstep, he'll know she's talking. But close. Eyes on the cafe and the rooming house where she sleeps, and someone who can be there in under a minute if something moves wrong. You want me on her. I want you available to her. Bailey picked up the pipe again and put the stem between his teeth. She trusts you. That's not nothing, given what she's been through with men in positions of authority. Use that trust, but don't abuse it. She'll give you what she has when she's ready and not before. Campbell stood. He thought about Irene at her counter with her folded cloth and her 2-second pauses, and the careful management of what she permitted herself to know out loud. There's one other thing, he said. Bailey waited. The night I was in Linton's office, someone else came in after me. Used the Surveyor Street entrance, went straight to the second drawer in the filing cabinet, checked the unlabeled folder, left. He held Bailey's eyes. Spent maybe 90 seconds in the room. Knew exactly where to go. Bailey's jaw set under the pipe stem. Reardon. Or someone Reardon sent. Light tread on the stair. Campbell picked up his hat from the chair arm. Linton didn't send him to recover the letter. He sent him to confirm it was still there. Which means Linton already knows the letter exists and is comfortable leaving it where it is. He moved toward the door. Which means either he's not afraid of it, or he's waiting for someone to try to use it. Bailey's eyes tracked him to the threshold. Walk carefully, Bailey said. I have been. Walk more carefully than that. Campbell went out into the white midday heat and turned south toward the cafe, and he thought about what it meant that Linton had left Jorgensen's letter in that folder and had sent Reardon not to take it but only to verify it was there. A man who kept a weapon in a known location and made sure it wasn't disturbed was a man who intended to use it. The only question was when and at whom, and whether Campbell could figure out the answer to both before Linton decided the time had come. Chapter 14. He spotted Reardon the second morning. Not the first. The first morning, he'd been too occupied with the pattern of his own movements, establishing a routine, letting himself be read, making himself predictable in the ways that invited predictability in return. The livery, at first light. Coffee at the cafe. A circuit of the main street, unhurried, as a deputy making himself visible. Bailey's office at 9. back along the east side of the street at noon. The routine of a man who had settled into the job and stopped looking for trouble. The second morning, he found Reardon in it. Not obviously. Reardon was too experienced for obvious. He was at the hardware store when Campbell came out of the livery, his back to the street, studying something in the window display that didn't merit study. When Campbell crossed to the cafe, Reardon drifted south along the boardwalk at a pace that kept the distance between them constant. When Campbell sat at the counter and nursed his coffee for 20 minutes, Reardon materialized at the far end of the street in a doorway, a cigarette going, his hat tipped forward. He never closed the distance. He never fell back. He held it, 30 yards, give or take, with the practiced discipline of a man who'd done surveillance work and understood that the amateur's error was pressure, getting too close, wanting to see rather than simply knowing. Campbell ordered a second cup of coffee and took his time with it. In the mirror behind Irene's counter, he could track Reardon's position without turning. He studied the deputy the way you study a problem you've been handed without instructions, looking for the shape of it before you decide what it requires. Reardon was lean, in the way of men who don't carry anything they don't need. Not tall but assembled compactly, everything about him, hat, coat, gun belt, worn without affectation, chosen for function. The face under the hat brim was angular and still, the kind of stillness that isn't repose but control. He'd been a useful man once, Campbell thought. Maybe still was, to the right employer. Irene refilled his cup without being asked, and didn't comment on the fact that he'd been sitting for 40 minutes. She'd understood 3 days ago what his presence at the counter meant, and she'd accommodated it with the practical acceptance of a woman who'd long since decided that being protected was preferable to the alternative, even if she hadn't asked for it. The man in the doorway, she said, her back to the room, wiping the already clean back counter. He was there yesterday too. Earlier. I know, Campbell said. She put the cloth down and moved to the far end of the counter and began stacking saucers. Busy work, distance work, the body finding tasks to occupy itself while the mind sits with something unpleasant. Is he going to be a problem? He already is one, Campbell said. The question is what kind. He let Reardon follow him for 2 full days before he changed the pattern. On the third day, he rode south out of town at mid-morning, not toward the sinks but on the Mescal Road toward the Venttor's homestead, or what was left of it. He rode at an easy pace, making no effort to lose the tail, and when he reached the fork at the split cottonwood, he turned off the road into the scrub, and dismounted, and tied the roan to a branch and sat on a flat rock, and ate the biscuits he'd brought from Mrs. Teller's breakfast and waited. Reardon came to the fork 8 minutes later, pulled up, and sat his horse in the road reading the situation. He'd have seen Campbell turn off. He'd have seen the tracks going into the brush. He sat there for 90 seconds, Campbell counted, and then rode past the fork and continued south without turning in. Campbell watched him go. A man following someone who'd stopped and clearly intended to be found out had 2 choices: close the distance and acknowledge the game, or maintain the pretense and ride on. Reardon had chosen the pretense, which told Campbell something about his orders. He wasn't supposed to confront. He was supposed to observe and report, and when the moment came, to act on a signal Campbell hadn't yet identified. He ate the last biscuit and thought about the pearl-handled Smith & Wesson. The gun was Jorgensen's. Reardon had access to Jorgensen's effects through the Three Deuces estate, which Linton administered. Getting the gun to the jail window required either Reardon himself on the outside of the building at the right hour, or someone Reardon had directed. The dry goods crate, placed in the afternoon. Oakes, who had been sleeping too deeply. The dun horse from Jorgensen's string, left behind the church at the right time. None of those things required Linton's direct involvement. All of them required someone with operational access to the valley's routines, who worked what shift, where horses were kept, How the jail ran at night. A deputy had that access. A deputy who'd been in the territory 14 months and spent his time learning how things worked rather than doing them. And then Larry in the Badlands, running on a horse that was meant to carry him somewhere he'd be found by the right people. Campbell stood and untied the roan and mounted. He rode back to the fork and turned north toward town, and he turned the logic of it in a direction he hadn't gone before. The plan had been clean at its conception. Larry escapes with a planted gun, rides south on a known horse toward Mexico. 3 men in the sinks, positioned and waiting. Reardon either among them or directing them. Larry's body found in rough country, shot while evading capture, or simply shot, and the capture invented after. A fugitive killed in the Badlands was not a mystery anyone investigated very hard, especially with a circuit judge 3 days out and a murder charge already filed. Except Charlie had come back from Mexico or never made it there, and Charlie knew the sinks, and Charlie had gotten his brother out before the 3 men closed the route. Which meant the plan had failed. Which meant Reardon was still running it, modified, waiting for Larry to surface again. And now he was watching Campbell, because Campbell was the one person in the valley with both the freedom to find Larry and the inclination to keep him alive when he did. The deputy wasn't following him to report his movements. He was following him to find Larry through him. He went to Bailey that evening and laid it out. Bailey sat with his cold pipe and his folded hands and his old lawman's face that held what it heard without showing what it thought, and when Campbell finished, Bailey was quiet for a stretch. "If Reardon finds Larry through you," Bailey said, "Larry is dead within the hour, and Reardon has a story prepared, and you have nothing that puts Reardon at the scene except your own testimony, which Linton's lawyers discredit in an afternoon." "Yes. So Larry can't come in through you." Bailey unfolded his hands, then set them flat on the desk. "He has to come in through me, directly, in a way that Reardon can't intercept or preempt." "Someone has to find him first," Campbell said. "And it can't be me, because Reardon is watching every road I ride." Bailey's eyes went to the map on the wall, the old linen map, still pinned where he'd left it 3 days ago. He studied it for a long moment without speaking, and Campbell had learned enough by now to wait that out. "Irene," Bailey said. Campbell shook his head. "She's already exposed. If Reardon's watching me, he's watching the cafe." "Not Irene directly." Bailey pushed up from the desk. "Charlie will make contact with someone. He came back once, he'll come back again, for his brother, for the homestead, for Irene Galloway, who Larry would die for." He moved to the map and put his finger on the South Range. "We put word out on a channel Reardon doesn't control. We let it find Charlie. We let Charlie bring Larry in." He turned from the map. "But to do that, we need Reardon looking somewhere else." Campbell held that. "You want me to lead him? I want you to give him something to follow that isn't Larry Venttor's." Bailey's jaw settled in the manner Campbell recognized, the old man arriving at a decision that cost him something and paying it anyway. "Ride north tomorrow. Take the Tucson road. Make it look like you're chasing a lead in that direction. Give Reardon a full day's ride before you turn back." He held Campbell's gaze steady. "Can you do that without tipping him that you know he's there?" "I've been doing it for 3 days, Campbell said. Bailey almost smiled. It was the closest he came to it, a slight easing around the eyes, there and gone. "Then do it one more day," he said. "One more day buys Larry Venttor's his life." Campbell picked up his hat from the chair arm and settled it on his head and went out into the blue early dark of the desert evening. Somewhere behind him, he knew without checking, a lean man in a functional hat had noted his departure from the sheriff's office and was adjusting his position accordingly. Let him adjust. Tomorrow, Campbell would give him a direction and a road and a full day's worth of wrong answer to follow. And while Reardon rode north, Charlie Ventors would be riding in from wherever the South Country had been keeping him, with his brother at his side, and the truth of what had happened in Shotgun Valley finally headed somewhere it could do some good. Chapter 15. He got the warning from an unlikely source. Pruitt at the livery, who noticed things the way old men notice things, not through intention, but through the accumulated habit of decades spent reading animals and the people who brought them in. He'd pulled Campbell aside that afternoon, while Campbell was brushing down the roan after the northward decoy ride, and told him in a low voice that Three Deuces Hands had come in before noon with a mule and a load of gear that included 2 kerosene tins, and that they'd left the tins with the mule and ridden back out south, and that a man who sold kerosene in that quantity alongside rope and axe handles was generally not planning on illuminating his parlor. Campbell had ridden for Hog Hollow immediately. He arrived 2 hours before dark, which gave him time to read the homestead and choose his ground. The Ventor's house sat on its bench above the creek with its shuttered windows and its empty corral and the kitchen garden going to seed behind the brush fence. Empty, as it had been for weeks. But the outbuildings were intact, the barn still standing, the chicken run, a low stone-walled equipment shed attached to the barn's east side that Jorgensen's men had missed or not bothered with when they'd come out to pull fence. That shed would do. He put the roan in a draw a quarter-mile north, out of the firelight that was going to be coming, and tied him deep in the mesquite where the smell of smoke wouldn't reach him. He went back to the homestead on foot, carrying the Winchester, and his revolver, and the box of rifle shells from his saddlebag, and he settled into the equipment shed and pulled the plank door to behind him, and found a gap in the stone wall that gave him a sight line across the yard to the house and the barn and the creek approach to the south. Then he waited. They came in after midnight, which told him they were serious. Amateurs rode at dusk, when they still had enough courage in them from the daylight hours. Men who did this for a living came when the target was deepest asleep and the dark was complete. He counted 6 horses on the creek approach before the lead rider cleared the cottonwoods. They came at a walk, no lanterns, spread across a 60-foot front, not a mob, a formation. Someone had organized them. He registered the mule among them, 2 riders managing it, the kerosene tin slung in canvas panniers across its back. He let them reach the yard. The first shot he put through the kerosene tin on the mule's left side. Not at a man, at the tin. The report of the Winchester off the stone walls of the shed was enormous in the night quiet, and the mule went sideways, and the tin punched through and streamed kerosene down the animal's flank, and the 2 men managing it had their hands full immediately. That bought him the first 4 seconds. He worked the lever and put the second round into the ground 12 inches in front of the lead horse's hooves. The horse reared. The rider stayed on, but his attention was fully occupied. 6 of you, Campbell called from the shed. And I know all 6 faces. Ride back to the 3 Deuces and stay there. The answer was a rifle shot that came from the south, from one of the riders who'd kept his head while the others sorted out their horses. It took a chunk off the top of the stone wall 8 inches above Campbell's position, and the stone chips stung his left cheek, and he dropped below the wall and moved 3 feet right before coming back up. Return fire from 2 more of them now, both rifles, one from the south approach and one from the east side of the yard where someone had gotten off his horse and taken cover behind the corral fence. The corral fence was boards, not stone, and it offered the illusion of cover rather than the substance of it. Campbell put a round through the 3rd board from the top and heard a sharp curse, and the man relocated. The mule handlers had the animal under control now, and the kerosene tins were intact, and someone was shouting an order Campbell couldn't fully hear. What he heard was the shed and flush him, and he understood the tactic immediately. 2 or 3 to pin him with fire while the others circled to the shed's blind side, where there was no gap in the wall and no sightline, and the plank door was the only exit. He went out the door at a run, angling north toward the barn, and the night lit up around him. The round caught him in the left side, high below the armpit. Not a rifle, a revolver from close range, someone who'd already moved to the barn side while he was calculating. The impact was a hard, flat punch that spun him left, and he went down on one knee in the dirt, and the Winchester came up by reflex, and he fired at the muzzle flash, and the revolver went silent. He got up. The left side of his shirt was wet, and the arm on that side didn't want to move the way he told it to, but the legs worked, and the right hand worked, and the Winchester was in it, and that was sufficient for the moment. He made the barn's north wall, and put his back to the stone and breathed. From the yard came the sound of horses being pulled around, men's voices tight and clipped, the specific controlled urgency of people reassessing. He dropped one of them, not killed from the sound of the cursing but down. 5 left functional plus the mule, and now they knew he was mobile and armed, and had taken a hit and kept moving, and that last part was the part that mattered. Men who'd taken a hit and kept moving required a different calculation than men who stayed behind a wall. One of them called toward the barn. "You're shot, deputy. Come out, and we'll get you to a doctor." Campbell said nothing. He worked along the north wall of the barn, toward its back corner, putting the building between himself and the yard. A long silence. Then hoofbeats, not the charge he'd half expected but retreat, moving south, unhurried but definite. He counted them. 6 horses and the mule, going back the way they'd come. They took their wounded man with them, which meant he was alive enough to move, and they were professional enough not to leave evidence. He stayed at the barn's back corner for 10 minutes after the sound had faded, because a retreat that orderly could also be a feint, and he was in no condition to manage a second engagement. But the desert went quiet in the way it goes quiet when it's genuinely empty, and after 10 minutes he came around to the yard. The kerosene tins were gone. They'd taken them when they pulled back. He stood in the middle of the Venttor's yard, with his left side leaking, and the night enormous around him, and he did a brief inventory. The wound was high enough to have missed the lung. He could breathe without the liquid sound that meant otherwise. The arm moved if he made it, just poorly. He'd need it looked at, but not in the next 10 minutes. He went into the house. Not to shelter, to finish what he'd come to do, which was look at the place Larry Venttor's had built and find what he'd left behind. Charlie in the South Range, checking fence and finding trouble. Larry at the homestead alone, every day for 6 years. A man alone in a house thought and read and wrote things down, and Larry Venttor's was not a man who kept his troubles only in his head. The main room was as he'd left it weeks ago, table, chairs, fireplace, the woman's quilt on the wall. He went to the fireplace and crouched and ran his hand along the underside of the mantel shelf and found nothing. Then the floorboards near the east wall, pressing each one for give. Third board from the corner lifted at the near end when he pressed the far end. A simple pivot, the nail on one side pulled and reset as a hinge. Below it, in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, a ledger. Smaller than Linton's, the kind a man buys from a dry goods store for household accounts. But the figures inside were not household accounts. He took it to the window, where the moon gave enough light to read by. Larry had been tracking the Three Deuces finances from the outside, not with access to Linton's books, but with the information available to a neighboring rancher who paid attention. Cattle tallies that didn't match auction records. Water rights payments that went to an unnamed intermediary rather than the territorial board. Deed transfers for 3 neighboring properties, with Larry's notation that the recorded sale prices were substantially lower than the assessed values he'd obtained from the county records in Tucson on a trip he'd made the previous spring. On the last page, in different ink, heavier pressure, as though written with decision rather than observation. Linton controls the accounts. Eastston doesn't know. 6 weeks to gather enough to take to a federal marshal. The date beside it was 3 weeks before Eastston was found dead in his buggy. Campbell held the ledger and felt the whole architecture of it settle into place. Larry investigating, getting close, Eastston finding out through his own channels, and confronting Linton moving before either Eastston or Larry could act. The frame around Larry, not an improvisation, but a contingency. Linton had always known Larry was a threat. He'd simply been waiting for a reason to use him. He tucked the ledger inside his coat, against his right side away from the wound, and walked out into the yard, and found the roan in the draw where he'd left him, and mounted with difficulty and turned north toward Palos Duros. The left side of his shirt had soaked through by the time the lights of town appeared. He rode straight to Bailey's office and knocked with his boot because both hands were occupied with staying on the horse. And when Bailey opened up and held the lamp to him and saw the shirt, the old man's jaw set in the manner that Campbell had come to recognize as Bailey taking the measure of a thing before he spoke about it. "Inside," Bailey said. Campbell got down from the horse and went inside. Chapter 16. He came back to himself in the room above Bailey's office. Not his room at Mrs. Teller's. Bailey had put him in the deputy's bunk, the spare room above the jail that smelled of old wood and coal oil, and the particular dust of a space used only occasionally. The wound had been cleaned by the doctor Bailey had roused at 2 in the morning, a man named Freund, who worked quickly and without commentary, and left a roll of bandaging and a bottle of something brown on the side table, and told Bailey to keep the patient flat for 24 hours. That had been yesterday. Campbell lay on the bunk with the brown bottle untouched beside him, and the morning light coming through a window that faced east, and he took inventory the way a man takes inventory after damage, not cataloging the pain but assessing the function. Left arm moved. Shoulder moved with resistance, and delivered a sharp report when he pushed it. The bandaging across his ribs was tight and held. He'd had worse twice in Texas, and both times he'd been riding inside a week. He heard the chair on the landing outside the room shift its weight, and then Irene Galloway knocked twice and opened the door. She carried a tray, coffee, biscuits, a bowl of something that steamed. She set it on the side table, with the efficiency of a woman who'd brought food to sick rooms before, moved the untouched brown bottle to the floor without comment, and pulled the chair to the bedside and sat in it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She poured his coffee and held the cup until he'd pushed himself up against the headboard and taken it, and then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the window. "Bailey told me what happened out there," she said. "How much?" "Enough." Her hands were flat and quiet on her skirt now. Not performing composure. Actually composed, in the way of someone who has made a decision and arrived on the far side of it. "He told me you found Larry's ledger. That Larry had been tracking the accounts for months," Campbell said. "He was going to take it to a federal marshal. He had a date in mind. 3 weeks before Jean died. Not a question." "You knew about the ledger?" "I knew Larry was doing something. He wouldn't tell me specifics. He said the less I knew, the safer I was." A small shift in her throat. He was right about that. It just didn't help. Campbell drank his coffee and let the room settle into its quiet. Outside, the morning street was building its noise. A wagon, voices, the ordinary machinery of a town, going about its day, indifferent to what had happened in Hog Hollow 12 hours ago. "Irene," he said, "tell me what you saw." She'd been ready for this. He could read it in the way she'd come in, the tray as an opening gesture, the composure that had been assembled rather than arrived at naturally, the hands in her lap, now absolutely motionless. She'd been deciding since Bailey had told her Campbell was alive, and in the room above the jail. She'd made the decision before she knocked. "The night Jean died," she said. "After he struck me. After he left with the documents I wouldn't sign." She drew a breath that she released with control. I told you someone came to the back door. I told you I didn't answer it. You told me you didn't know who it was. I lied. The two words arrived flat and without apology. I knew who it was. I recognized his voice through the door. He was speaking to someone on the street. One word, two words, something directed to a man passing. Tom Linton's voice is not a voice you mistake for another man's. Campbell set his cup down. Linton came to your back door that night. 20 minutes after Jean left. She held his attention across the narrow space between the chair and the bunk. I didn't answer. I heard him try the handle, and then I heard him say something I couldn't make out, and then he went around to the front and tried that door, and then he left. And you didn't tell Bailey. I was going to. Her jaw set. I was preparing to. I was trying to find a way to say it that didn't put me in the path of whatever was coming next. And then Jean turned up dead in his buggy and Larry was arrested and it became, she stopped. Started over. If I told Bailey that Linton had come to my door that night, Linton would know within hours that I'd placed him in town after Jean left. A woman who could do that could also say other things. And I was alone in a cafe that Linton had already tried to take from me, in a town where he controls half the functioning legal machinery. He's not going to hurt you, Campbell said. You don't know that. No. But I'm going to make it very difficult for him to try. She took that at its face value, which was all he'd offered. Then she looked at the window and squared herself and went on. 3 nights before Jean died, he came to supper. Late past 8 after I'd closed. He knocked, and I let him in, and I could see immediately that something had broken open in him. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't frightened, the way I'd seen him frightened before. He was, she searched for the word with a directness that told Campbell she'd been turning it over for weeks. Furious. The cold kind that sits under the surface and doesn't move. He sat at the counter and told me that he'd found discrepancies in the ranch accounts going back 2 years. He'd had an outside man, someone from Tucson, not Linton, look at the books. The outside man had found the transfers. $9,400, Campbell said. Something crossed her face, recognition, and beneath it the relief of a fact named by someone other than herself. He told me a number close to that. He'd confronted Linton that afternoon. Linton had denied it, offered an explanation for the transfers that Jean said was plausible enough to make a clean proof difficult. That was the problem. Linton had done it carefully enough that the transfers looked like legitimate ranch business, unless you knew what to look for. But Eastston knew. Eastston knew. And he told Linton that he had 48 hours to return the money and resign as a state attorney, or he'd go to the territorial courts and the bar association. She drew a slow breath. Then he left my cafe. I didn't know that was the last time I'd see him alive. I didn't know Linton had been outside. He was following Eastston, Campbell said. He must have been. Or he'd had Eastston watched. Either way, he heard what Jean said to me, or enough of it. Enough to know that Jean had given him 48 hours, and intended to use them. Which Linton couldn't allow. No. Her hands were still in her lap. Jean wouldn't have left his buggy at the Three Deuces gate for no reason. Someone called him there, or stopped him there. Someone he wouldn't have refused to meet. She held Campbell's gaze without wavering. That's what I believe. I can't prove it. But you asked me what I know and what I think, and that's both. Lee Bell, Campbell said. Linton would have needed someone at the ranch. Someone in position to establish where the body was found, and provide the witness account, and make sure the evidence pointed the right direction. She said it with the flat precision of someone who has had months to reason through a horror. Lee Bell was Jean's cook. He had access to the ranch, he knew the routines, and he was in a position where Linton could apply either money or pressure. Possibly both. His testimony is too clean, Campbell said. I noted it from the first hearing. He described the coat, the horse, the angle, the moonlight, every element Bailey needed to make the identification credible. A genuine witness fills in gaps. Bell had no gaps. Because he was told what to say. Or shown what to say. Which is worse. It means he was at that scene before he testified to seeing it. She absorbed that. The room held its quiet for a stretch, just the sounds of the street below and the creak of the building settling in the morning heat. There's one more thing, Irene said. He waited. The night Linton came to my back door. When he tried the handle, and I didn't answer. She lifted her eyes from her hands to his. There was someone with him. I heard 2 sets of boots on the step. Whoever the second man was, he didn't speak. But he was there. Campbell held that for a moment, turning it against what he already had. Reardon. Outside Irene's door the night of the murder, while Linton went to the Three Deuces and killed Gene Eastston in his buggy. Not present for the killing, present for the management of what came after. Making sure Irene was inside and quiet. Checking the street. The operational half of what Linton had conceived. Can you testify to all of this? Campbell said. Irene looked at him, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the considered assessment of a woman pricing what she was about to spend. Yes, she said. I can and I will. But I need to know that Larry is alive. I need to know that before I walk into any room with a judge in it. I'm working on that, Campbell said. Work faster, she said. She picked up the tray and stood and left, and the door closed behind her with a quietness that carried more weight than a slam would have, and Campbell lay on the bunk in the morning light and held the full shape of it in his mind for the first time, complete interlocking, every piece fitted against the next. He needed to be on his feet. He needed to be on his feet today. He sat up and reached for the bandaging with his left hand, and began testing what he could make the shoulder do. Chapter 17. Bailey spent 2 days letting the word travel. He did it the way experienced men do it, not by telling anyone directly, but by allowing the information to exist near people who would move it along. A remark to Pruitt about a rider seen on the South Road, who might have been one of the Venttor's boys. A question asked of the 2 Spots Day bartender about whether anyone had been out Hog Hollow Way recently, the question itself being the point rather than the answer. Dropping the name Irene Galloway in conversation with the county recorder's office, in the context of a potential property matter, at the Venttor's place. He let it find Linton's ears in whatever channel Linton used, and then he sat back and gave it time to move through that channel to Reardon, and he gave Reardon time to plan. Campbell spent those 2 days recovering. The shoulder functioned, not well but adequately, which was the standard he needed it to meet. He could draw, and he could hold the Winchester without the left arm giving out under the weight, and on the morning of the 3rd day, he rode the roan south toward the hollow, and spent an hour in the brush above the old Venttor's place, reading the ground and the approaches, and selecting his cover. The cabin was not the main house on the bench, that sat a 1/4 mile further north. The old cabin was lower, near the creek, a structure Larry and Charlie had used when they first came to the land before the main house was built. 2 rooms, low roof, a stone chimney at the east end. The south wall faced the creek crossing, the only approach from the Mescal Road that didn't require going past the main house first. He chose a position in the creekside willows, 30 yards northwest of the cabin, where the ground gave him a clear angle on the south approach and the cabin entry, and the small window in the east wall. He found a second position behind a fallen cottonwood on the opposite bank, and marked it in his mind for Bailey. Then he rode back to town and told Bailey what he'd found. Tonight, Bailey said, Tonight. They went in separately. Bailey took the main road and came in from the north, cutting down to the creek 100 yards above the cabin and settling behind the cottonwood before full dark. Campbell came from the west across open scrubland, approaching the willows from an angle that kept the cabin between him and any watcher coming up the Mescal Road from the south. He reached the willows with an hour of gray light left and made himself part of them. The creek ran low this time of year, barely enough to cover the stones in the crossing, and it made almost no sound. What sounds there were belonged to the hollow, a nighthawk working the insect hatch above the creek, the high dry calling of something in the brush to the east, the creak of the cottonwoods under a wind that didn't reach ground level. The air in the hollow smelled of creek mud and dry grass, and the faint char of old ash from the cabin chimney, unlit for weeks. He lay on his right side to keep the wound out of the dirt, the Winchester across his forearms, and let the hollow go dark around him. An hour passed. Then another. The stars came out above the ridge to the east, and the creek stones caught what light there was and threw it back pale and diffuse, enough to read movement against, but not enough for faces or details. He held his breathing at a rate that wouldn't make a sound, and kept his body flat against the willow roots and tracked the approaches with his ears more than his eyes. Reardon came at the second hour. He came from the south on foot, which meant he'd left his horse on the road and covered the last quarter-mile walking, which was professional and patient, and told Campbell that the deputy had done this before in conditions that required it. He moved through the scrub below the cabin without sound, not without footfall, but without the incidental noise of a man who wasn't attending to his own sound. He crossed the creek downstream of the cabin at a shallow point, not the main crossing, which was the route a man chose when he didn't want to be where he was expected. He took cover at the south corner of the cabin, with his back to the stone wall. Campbell clocked the position and held it. Reardon's body against the south wall put him at a near-perfect angle to the cabin's entry and to the main crossing, where anyone coming from the road would have to commit their weight to the stepping stones. A man who'd chosen that corner had chosen it for that angle. He wasn't here to talk. The hollow went back to its sounds. The nighthawk. The cottonwood creek. Somewhere above the ridge, a coyote said something to the sky and then stopped, and the quiet that followed was deeper than the quiet before. Then hoofbeats on the Mescal Road, slowing as they neared the hollow. 2 horses. Campbell tracked the sound as it left the road and came down through the scrub toward the creek, and he registered that the pace was unhurried, not cautious, not fleeing, the even pace of a man coming to a place he'd agreed to come to. At the creek crossing, the horses stopped. A voice came across the water, low. Irene. Larry Venttor's. And then a second voice, answering from the near bank, from a position at the creek's edge that Campbell had not registered in 2 hours of listening. She's not here yet. Come across. Charlie Venttor's, on the near bank. Campbell heard Reardon move at the cabin's south corner. A single controlled shift of weight, a boot finding purchase on the dry ground, a body rearranging from cover into something more operative. The sound was small and clean and exactly what it was. He had perhaps 4 seconds. Reardon, Campbell said, loud enough to carry across the hollow. Don't. The shot came from the cabin corner anyway, not aimed at Campbell, at the creek crossing, at the sound of Larry Venttor's horse on the stepping stones. Campbell was already moving through the willows, closing the 30 yards between his cover and the cabin corner at a run, the Winchester in his right hand, the left shoulder screaming as the motion pulled at the bandaging. He went around the south corner of the cabin in 3 strides and came up hard against Reardon's back in the same motion, driving the deputy into the stone wall face first with his left forearm across the man's shoulder blades. The second shot went into the ground. Reardon was strong and fast, and he turned inside Campbell's grip with the efficiency of a man trained to do exactly that, driving his elbow back into the wound site. Campbell lost his grip and staggered, and Reardon came around with a revolver, and the cabin corner caught Campbell across the back as he twisted, and they were chest to chest in the darkness at the south wall of the old cabin with 3 feet between them and each man's gun coming up. "Stop!" Bailey's voice from the cottonwood on the far bank, flat and absolute. "Both of you." The creek crossing filled the silence that followed, the low sound of water over stone, completely indifferent to what was happening on the bank above it. Reardon's revolver held on Campbell. Campbell's Winchester held on Reardon. Neither man moved. On the creek's far bank, in the darkness above the crossing stones, 2 horses stood with their riders aboard. Larry Venttor's, unshot. Charlie Venttor's beside him. Neither moving, both watching the south corner of the cabin, where 2 armed men had arrived at a standstill in the dark. "Reardon," Bailey said. "Lower it." Reardon did not lower it. His breath was even. His arm was level. He held his angle on Campbell's chest with the absolute focus of a man who had committed to an outcome and was now calculating whether the situation had changed enough to alter the calculation. And Campbell could see in the set of his frame that the calculation had not yet resolved. The Nighthawk made 1 pass above the creek and angled away into the dark above the ridge. Campbell held the Winchester level and kept his eyes on Reardon's right hand and waited to see which way it fell. Chapter 18. Reardon's calculation resolved. He went left, not right, which was what Campbell had been tracking, and drove his shoulder into the cabin wall and put 4 feet between them in the same motion and fired. Campbell threw himself flat, and the round went through the air where his chest had been and hit the stone chimney behind him and scattered chips across the ground. He came up on his right elbow, and the Winchester was still in his grip, and he found Reardon already moving again, west along the south wall toward the brush, putting the corner of the cabin between himself and the creek where Bailey was positioned. Smart. Reardon was tactically smart, which Campbell already knew, and what he was doing now was trading the standoff's disadvantage, 2 guns on him, for a running engagement in broken ground where he could use speed and darkness and his marksmanship at range. A man pinned against a wall lost. A man moving in brush at night with a proven eye chose his moments. Campbell went after him. He came around the west corner of the cabin low and fast and found the brush empty. Reardon already through it and into the scrubland beyond, a shape dissolving into the dark of the hillside. A shot came from somewhere in that dark, aimed at the sound of Campbell's boots on the dry ground, and it went wide by 2 feet, but close enough that Campbell felt the displaced air. He dropped into the creek wash that ran along the cabin's west side, dry this time of year, 3 feet deep, gravel floor, and moved north through it at a crouch, putting the wash's bank between himself and the hillside. On the creek behind him, a shot. Then, another. Reardon had an angle on the crossing from the hillside, and he was using it, not at Campbell, but at the horses, at the men on the horses, at Larry Venttor's on the near bank. Campbell heard Larry go down. Not the horse, the rider. A short clipped sound, involuntary, the kind a body makes when something hits it that it wasn't braced for. Then Charlie's voice, Larry, low and urgent, cut off by another shot that threw gravel from the creek bank a foot from where the voice had come from. Bailey fired from the cottonwood, 2 rounds rapid, aimed at the muzzle flash on the hillside. Silence from the hill for 15 seconds. Then Reardon's answer, 1 precise round that found the cottonwood's trunk 18 inches from Bailey's cover, and the old man went flat. Pinned. Bailey flat behind the cottonwood, Charlie managing a wounded man and a frightened horse on the creek bank, Campbell in the dry wash, 50 yards from any angle on the hillside position. Reardon had found his ground, and it was a good one. Elevated, cover on 3 sides, a sightline to every approach. He could hold that position until dawn, and make any move toward him very expensive. Unless someone moved from a direction he hadn't covered. Campbell lay in the wash and thought fast. The hillside position was approachable from the north, above and behind Reardon, coming down off the ridge. But reaching the ridge required crossing 400 yards of open ground north of the cabin, under that sightline, in the time it took to make the traverse. At night, with a wounded shoulder, at a run. He put the odds on that, and didn't like them. The south side of the hill dropped into the Mescal Road. Someone on the road could angle up the south face and come at Reardon from behind and below, outside his sightlines. But getting to the road from the hollow meant the creek crossing, which Reardon was watching. From the creek bank, Charlie's voice again, lower this time. He's breathing. It's his leg. Keep him flat, Campbell said from the wash. Just loud enough. No more. The hollow went quiet, except for the creek, and the sound of Charlie working over his brother in the dark. And then from the direction of the Mescal Road, from the south, from outside the hollow entirely, a sound Campbell hadn't expected and hadn't planned for. A lantern coming up the road, swinging with the movement of someone walking, and a voice carrying clear across the dry night air. Irene Galloway's voice, loud and deliberate, calling out a name that wasn't any of theirs. Hello. Is anyone? I heard shots. Is anyone hurt, down there? The lantern swung and bobbed, and threw its light across the road in a wide arc. She was walking toward the hollow, openly, making noise, the lantern in her hand painting her in yellow light against the dark scrubland. Reardon's attention broke. It had to. A lit figure on a road was information he had to process, had to account for, had to decide about. 2 seconds, maybe 3, while the hillside position turned toward the road, and the muzzle of his rifle swung south. Campbell came out of the dry wash at a run. He went wide east of the cabin, and hit the base of the hill without slowing, and went up it the way you go up steep ground in the dark, hands and feet, body low, trusting the slope to carry weight that the legs couldn't. He heard Reardon's movement above him before he saw him, the shift of a boot on loose shale, the small clatter of displaced stone, and he went left across the hill face, angling toward the sound, and came up over a shelf of rock, and Reardon was there. 5 feet. No more. Reardon had the rifle. He swung it, but the barrel was long and the shelf was narrow, and it caught the rock edge and deflected, and in the half-second that cost him, Campbell drove forward off his back foot and hit him in the center of mass with his left shoulder, the wounded one, which reported the impact with a white flash of pain that he filed and moved past, and they went down together on the shelf with the rifle between them and the hillside dropping away to the hollow below. The rifle went over the edge. They separated on the rock shelf, and both men came upright in the same motion, the same speed, 3 feet apart on a shelf of limestone not wide enough for what came next, and Reardon's hand went to his holster. Campbell drew. The report of the revolver off the limestone face was enormous. It rang across the hollow and up the ridge and came back off the far wall of the basin in a diminishing echo, and then it was done, and the only sound was the echo fading, and the creek below, and the distant sound of Irene's lantern swinging as she ran toward the hollow. Reardon went down on the shelf and did not move. Campbell stood over him with the revolver and looked at his right hand, the one that had cleared leather, and noted without particular interest that it was entirely steady. He'd been afraid, going up that hill. He wasn't now. Whatever fear there'd been had burned off in the action of the thing, and left something cooler in its place, something that wasn't satisfaction, but wasn't grief either. Just the flat acknowledgement of what the moment had required, and what he'd been able to give it. He went back down the hill. Larry Venttor was on his back at the creek bank, with his brother crouched over him, when Campbell came across the crossing. The wound was in the left thigh, messy but not arterial. Charlie had a tourniquet on it already, improvised from his bandana, tightened with a stick. "He needs a doctor," Charlie said. He didn't look up. "He'll get one." Campbell crouched on the bank and put his hand briefly on Larry's shoulder. The man's face was gray in the lantern light that Irene was now bringing down the road toward them, but his eyes were open and tracking. "Can you hear me?" "I hear you," Larry said. "You're going to be all right." "I know." A pause that had something exhausted and rueful in it. "I've been trying to come in for 2 weeks. Every time I tried, there was someone on the road." "I know." Campbell stood. "It's done now. You're coming in." Bailey's voice came from the cottonwood, nearer now. "Reardon." "On the hill," Campbell said. "He won't need the doctor." The old sheriff came down to the bank and stood over Larry Venttor's for a moment, taking the measure of him in the lantern light. Then he looked at Charlie, who was still working the tourniquet. "You came back," Bailey said. Charlie didn't look up. "He's my brother." Bailey nodded once and left it there. Irene reached the creek crossing with her lantern and stopped at the water's edge. Her eyes moved to Larry on the bank, to Charlie over him, to Bailey beside them, to Campbell. She held Campbell's attention for one moment with a question in it. Not about Reardon, not about the gun, about Larry. He answered it with a small nod. She came across the stepping stones and knelt beside Larry and took his hand in both of hers, and what she said to him was between them. Campbell walked back up to the cabin and sat against the south wall, where Reardon had stood an hour ago, and let his shoulder have its complaint in private. Above the hollow, the stars were going pale at the eastern rim of the ridge. An hour, maybe less, before first light. He had what he needed. Larry alive, Charlie back, Irene ready to testify, the ledger in Bailey's possession, and Reardon off the board. What remained was Linton, the man who had designed all of it, who had never once done the dirty work himself, who had sat in his office on the east side of the main street and moved people and money and law like counters on a board. That conversation was coming. It would happen in Palos, Duros, in daylight, and it would happen today. Chapter 19. They came into Palos Duros at sunrise, 6 of them, and a body across a saddle. Larry Venttor's rode with his wounded leg splinted between 2 cottonwood branches that Charlie had cut at the creek and bound with strips from his own shirt. He sat his horse with his jaw set and his hands tight on the pommel and said nothing for the 7 miles, which was either stubbornness or the particular silence of a man saving what he had left for what came next. Charlie rode beside him. Irene had taken the roan from Campbell at Hog Hollow. Campbell's shoulder no longer permitted sustained riding, and she rode it with the practical ease of a woman who'd grown up on horseback before a cafe in a cow town had become her life. Bailey led, and Campbell rode drag, and Reardon's dun horse came last with its cold cargo. The town read them as they came up the main street. A freighter outside the feed store stopped working his harness and watched them pass. 2 women on the boardwalk outside the dry goods held their market baskets and held their ground. The barman at the 2 spot stepped out onto the gallery above the door and leaned on the rail and didn't go back inside. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a dozen people had gathered at a respectful distance on both sides of the street, the way crowds gather when they sense that something they've been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it has finally arrived. Bailey dismounted and tied his horse, and went to the office door, and opened it and stood aside. "Inside," he said. They helped Larry down, and got him through the door and into the chair that held the most of his weight. Charlie stood behind him. Irene took the chair beside the desk. Campbell remained near the door, not blocking it, but positioned where he could see both the street and the room's interior. Bailey sent one of the men who'd gathered outside to fetch the circuit judge from the hotel, where he'd been waiting since Wednesday. He sent another to find the county recorder. Then he sat behind his desk and put his hands flat on the wood and waited. Tom Linton arrived 12 minutes later. He came without his attorney's bag, which meant someone had told him the nature of the summons before he'd had time to think through what he should bring. He wore his coat and his careful grooming and the composed face he wore in all professional situations, and he came through the office door and took the room in one sweeping read. Larry Venttor's in the chair, Charlie behind him, Irene at the desk, Campbell at the door, and whatever he'd expected, it had not been this particular arrangement. His composure held. It was a remarkable thing to witness, Campbell thought. The man's internal machinery was running hard and showing nothing. "Sheriff," Linton said, "I understand you wanted to see me." "Sit down, Tom." Linton sat in the remaining chair and crossed one knee over the other with his usual precision, and rested his hands on his thigh and gave Bailey his complete attention. Bailey opened his desk drawer and set 3 things on the wood between them. The pearl-handled Smith & Wesson, recovered from the Venttor cell the morning of the jailbreak. The smaller of the 2 ledgers, Larry's from the floorboard cache at Hog Hollow. And a folded document that Campbell recognized as the unsigned property transfer Linton had brought to Irene's cafe the night Eastston died. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Bailey said, "and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to speak to it. I'd prefer to have legal representation present before." "You are legal representation," Bailey said. "And what I'm telling you isn't a question. It's a statement of what happened in this valley, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from a judge." Linton's hands on his thigh were flat and composed. He said nothing. Bailey told it. He told it the way he did everything, in order, without ornament, each fact placed against the next with the care of a man who has been building toward this moment for a long time and means to get it right. The transfers from the 3 Deuces accounts, 31 in 19 months, $9,400 to an account Linton controlled. Jorgensen's arrangement, the letter in the unlabeled folder, the 20%. Eastston confronting Linton after engaging an outside auditor. Linton's 48-hour deadline, and what he'd done with the time instead of meeting it. The stage scene at the 3 Deuces gate, Lee Bell positioned and rehearsed, the frame around Larry Venttor's assembled before Eastston's body was cold. He told it for 8 minutes without stopping. When he finished, the office held its quiet. Outside, through the single window that faced the street, the sound of Palos Duros continuing its mourning, the freighter resuming his work, a horse at the rail shifting its weight, somewhere south the clang of a smithy fire being stoked. "That's a serious set of allegations," Linton said. His voice was measured and even. "Without corroboration." "Irene Galloway places you in town the night Eastston died," Bailey said. "She recognized your voice at her back door 20 minutes after Eastston left her cafe. She'll testify to that." Linton's eyes moved to Irene for the first time. She held his gaze without expression, without flinching, without any of the fear she'd carried for months. Whatever she felt now, she'd decided he wasn't going to see it. "She also places a second man with you at that door," Bailey continued. "We know that man was Bill Reardon. Reardon is no longer available to offer a contrary account." Something moved in Linton's face, briefly, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, there and gone. He'd understood what that meant. "Furthermore," Bailey said, "Larry Venttor's kept his own record of 3 Deuces financial irregularities. Cross-referenced against the county's public deed records, his figures confirm the pattern in your own books." He set his hand flat on the smaller ledger. "Reardon arranged the jailbreak and rode with the men who went to Hog Hollow last night. He fired on officers of the law and a civilian witness, wounded Larry Venttor's, and was killed in the commission of those acts." Bailey's voice carried no satisfaction in any of it. "Just wait. That's the shape of it, Tom. All of it." The room waited. Linton uncrossed his knee and set both feet flat on the floor, and drew a breath through his nose and let it out the same way. When he spoke, his voice had shed the professional composure and arrived at something below it. Not quite desperation, but the ground beneath composure when composure has run its course. You have a cook's testimony that can be impeached. You have a dead man who can't corroborate anything. You have a woman who hates me, and a fugitive who needs an alibi, and a set of ledger figures that any competent attorney. You're not going to attorney your way out of this one, Campbell said from the door. Linton looked at him. A long, flat look, the kind a man gives the thing he underestimated. No, Linton said. I don't suppose I am. His right hand went to his coat. Campbell was moving before the hand cleared the lapel, not toward Linton but sideways, putting the desk between them, and Bailey went left out of the chair with a speed that belied his 60 years, and Charlie Venttor drove his brother's chair back hard against the wall and put his own body in front of it. The small-bore Derringer Linton had produced from his inside breast pocket went off once, the report enormous in the confined space, and the round went into the ceiling above the desk and brought down a shower of plaster dust. Campbell had the man's wrist before he could cock the second barrel. He held it, Linton's gun hand, wrist locked, the Derringer pointed at the ceiling, and looked at Linton across the desk from a distance of 18 inches and waited for the resistance to go out of the arm. It took 4 seconds. Then the lawyer's wrist went slack, and Campbell took the Derringer from fingers that had stopped insisting and set it on the desk beside the other evidence. Bailey already had the manacles from his drawer. Tom Linton, Bailey said, coming around the desk, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Eugene Eastston, the suborning of false testimony, the embezzlement of ranch accounts held in fiduciary trust, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Lawrence Venttor. He snapped the first cuff and reached for the second. There may be additional charges. The circuit judge will sort that out. Linton said nothing. He stood with his wrists being bound, and his coat speckled with ceiling plaster, and the careful edifice of everything he'd built in Shotgun Valley coming apart around him in the morning light, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it where it had always lived, behind the professional face, in the place nobody got to see. The circuit judge arrived 7 minutes later, with the county recorder behind him, and a small crowd pressing in from the street. Campbell stepped out onto the boardwalk and let the legal machinery take the room. The main street of Palos Duros lay before him in the full morning light, the feed store, the two-spot, the dry goods, Irene's cafe with its sign turned to eats and its windows lit. Ordinary and intact, the town that had been living under Linton's shadow for 2 years without knowing the full shape of what it was living under. He stood on the boardwalk in the light and breathed the morning air and let it be quiet for a moment. Behind him, through the office wall, he heard Bailey's voice reading the charges aloud for the record, even and unhurried, each count placed with care, the way the old sheriff did everything that mattered. Chapter 20. 3 weeks passed before the circuit judge finished with Palos Duros. It was not a fast business. Linton had been right about one thing. He was an attorney, and even facing the evidence assembled against him, he used every procedural instrument available, challenging the provenance of the ledgers, the admissibility of Irene's testimony, the circumstances of Reardon's death. It bought him time and cost him nothing, since the outcome was not in doubt from the first day the judge opened his docket. A man who impeaches his own bookkeeping is a man who has already lost. Liebel recanted his false testimony on the second day, which saved him from the worst of the charges against him, and gave the prosecution what it needed to close the frame entirely. He did it quietly, in a prepared statement read by the judge's clerk, without drama and without looking at anyone in the courtroom. Campbell had expected relief when it happened. What he felt instead was something closer to pity. A man who had let himself be used and then had to live in the same town as the consequences. Larry Venttor's exoneration came on the 4th day. He was in the gallery with his leg still bandaged, and Charlie beside him and Irene on his other side, and when the judge read the ruling, Larry sat with his hands on his thighs and his head down for a long moment, and then he raised it and looked at the ceiling above the courtroom and let out a breath that seemed to have been held since the night Jorgensen fell in the two-spot. Charlie put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Irene took his hand. Campbell watched from the back of the room and decided that was enough. He went outside. Bailey came to find him that evening at Mrs. Teller's, which was unusual. The old sheriff generally sent word when he wanted a meeting, rather than coming himself. He knocked at the room door and came in and took the chair, and put his hat on his knee and looked at the braided rug on the floor for a moment before he spoke. "I've written the letter," Bailey said. "To who?" "Territorial Governor. Recommending you as my replacement." He turned his hat on his knee. "The appointment is his to make, but a retiring sheriff's recommendation carries weight out here. He'll follow it." Campbell sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees. Outside the window, the last of the day's light was going amber over the western ridgeline, the sky above it shading into the deep blue that preceded full dark in this country. Somewhere down the street, the two-spots piano had found its evening stride. "You've thought this through," Campbell said. "I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks." Bailey shifted in the chair. "The valley needs law that isn't for sale. Linton spent 2 years demonstrating what happens when the law in a place serves the man with the most money rather than the people who live under it." He set his hat on the chair arm. "You're not from here. That's not a liability. It's why you could see what men who grew up here stopped seeing. Fresh eyes, no debt to any of the old arrangements." "I came here running from something," Campbell said. "Most men worth anything came to the territory, running from something." Bailey looked at him directly. "What matters is what you did when you got here. You did your job. You kept faith with people who needed you to. You made the hard calls when they came, and you made them right." He paused. "The man you killed in Texas, the one who reached for his wallet. Does that sit differently now than it did 6 months ago?" Campbell thought about it the way he'd stopped letting himself think about it, honestly and without the protective distance of years. "No," he said. "It sits the same. It was a mistake. A fast draw and bad light, and a man who shouldn't have reached for anything in that moment, but who reached anyway, and I'll carry that." "Yes," Bailey said. "You will. That's the right answer. A man who's done something he can't undo and knows it and carries it properly. That's the man I want behind this badge. Not a man who's never made a mistake. Not a man who's decided his mistakes don't count." He stood and picked up his hat. "I'm retiring at the end of the month. Think about it." He left, and his footsteps went down the hall and the stairs and out into the evening, and the room held the weight of what he'd said. Campbell sat for a long time after, watching the window go dark. He found Larry and Charlie Venttor's at the Hog Hollow place 4 days later. They'd been out there since the trial ended, sleeping in the barn and working the main house back into something habitable. New glass in the windows Jorgensen's men had broken, new plank on the porch where the boards had rotted through, the kitchen garden cleared and turned for a late planting. The smell of fresh-cut timber reached the road before Campbell could see the house. Larry was on the porch with his leg propped and a set of surveys spread across a sawhorse table when Campbell rode up. He moved with a cane now, would for a while, the doctor had said, possibly for good. He watched Campbell dismount without getting up, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "The south fence is still down," Larry said. "I know. I'll get men on it. 3 Deuces Range is in receivership. I heard the estate attorney from Tucson is trying to sort out the legitimate debts from what Linton stole." He shuffled the surveys. "Some of those boundary lines were never properly recorded. If the territorial court sorts them the way I think it should, about 400 acres of what Eastston called 3 Deuces South Range is actually Venttor's range." "You'll need an attorney," Campbell said. I know a good one in Tucson. The ghost of something crossed Larry's face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The first light of an expression that had been a long time returning. Irene knows him. She's been handling more of this than I have. She'd be good at it, Campbell said. She's good at everything she decides to do. Larry set the surveys down and looked out at the South Range with its creekline and its good grass and the low ridges that rimmed it. You know she's going to keep the cafe. I figured. She says she'll come out here on Sundays. That's her offer. He was quiet a moment. I told her that was more than fair. Campbell stood in the yard with the smell of cut timber and turned earth around him, and the creek audible somewhere below the bench, running a little higher this week from a rain that had come through 3 days ago and greened up the desert in that brief, decisive way it did in late summer. The roan cropped at the sparse grass by the corral fence. Charlie's staying, Campbell said. For now. He's got his own ideas about what to do with himself eventually. But for now he's staying. Larry turned from the range view. You taking the job? I'm thinking on it. Think faster, Larry said. This valley needs a sheriff who won't end up in Linton's pocket. Campbell heard the echo of Irene in that, work faster, and suspected it wasn't accidental. He rode back to Palos Duros in the long afternoon light, the roan moving easy under him. The country opening up around the Mescal Road in the way it did in the quieter hours, the shadows long and specific across the Caliche Flats, the creosote throwing its particular gray-green against the red stone of the ridges, a hawk riding a thermal above the East Range without apparent effort or urgency. He'd ridden into this valley 5 months ago on that same road, running from a dead man's cousin and from his own accounting of what he'd done in a bad light with a fast hand. He told Mrs. Teller he was looking for rest, which was partially true and mostly not. What he'd been looking for, without the clarity to name it, was a place where the reckoning he owed could be paid in something other than distance. He thought it might be this place. Bailey's last day was a Friday. He spent it doing paperwork, the meticulous, unhurried paperwork of a man closing out 22 years of records with the care they deserve. Campbell sat across the desk through most of the afternoon, learning the filing system, the county contacts, the informants Bailey had cultivated quietly over 2 decades, who would not be apparent in any document, but whose names the old sheriff passed on with a word about each one. Small pieces of institutional knowledge, accumulated across a working life, being handed from one man to another across a desk in an adobe building in the Arizona Territory. At 4 in the afternoon, Bailey opened his desk drawer and set the sheriff's star on the wood between them. It was the real one, not the deputy's tin stamp Campbell had been wearing, but Bailey's own badge, worn silver with years of handling, the star's points slightly rounded from use. A small dent on the bottom left point, where it had been dropped on a stone floor once, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Campbell held it in his palm and felt the weight of it. It's heavier than it looks, Bailey said. Yes. It gets heavier. Bailey stood and came around the desk and extended his hand, and they shook the way they'd shaken the day Campbell had taken the deputy's badge, 1 beat past what was necessary, because Bailey meant it. Do the job right, and the weight becomes manageable. Try to do it easy, and it breaks you. He picked up his hat from the chair arm and put it on and walked to the door and opened it, and stood in the frame with the late afternoon light behind him, Palos Duros, going about its end-of-day business in the street beyond. Walk carefully, he said. Campbell looked up from the badge in his hand. I know. Yes, Bailey said. You do. He went out into the light and turned south toward the rooming house where he'd already arranged his retirement, and Campbell watched him until the crowd on the boardwalk absorbed him and he was gone. The office was quiet. The filing cabinet stood in the corner. The gun rack held its Winchester and its shotgun. The coffee pot on the stove had an inch of cold coffee in it from the morning, and the linen map of the valley was still pinned on the wall above the desk, the old one, with Bailey's penciled additions showing the valley as it was rather than as the surveys said it should be. Campbell crossed to the window and looked out at the main street of Palos, Duros, the feed store, the two-spot, the dry goods, Irene's cafe with its Eat sign and its lit windows, the livery at the south end where Pruitt would be finishing his evening rounds. A town that had been held in someone's fist for 2 years and didn't fully know yet what it felt like to breathe without that pressure. It would learn. He pinned the star to his chest, Bailey's star, worn silver, the dented point at the bottom left, and felt the unfamiliar weight of it settle against his shirt. 5 months ago, he'd ridden into this valley with a price on his head from Texas and a dead man's wallet in his memory, and nothing ahead of him but the next place to be that wasn't the last place. He told himself he was looking for rest. What he'd found instead was harder than rest, and more demanding, and altogether different from anything he'd thought to look for. He'd found something worth doing, and the people worth doing it for. That was enough. More than enough. He picked up his hat and settled it on his head and walked out the door into the last of the afternoon light, and the street received him the way a street receives a man who belongs on it, without ceremony and without question. The work was waiting. It always was. He went to meet it. The end.